Did you know that a bunch of ghost-type Pokédex entries quietly got rewritten over the years? So they talk less about dead children and stolen souls and more about, light mischief and stuff like that. The same Pokemon, the same world. But if you compare the games side by side, the words just soften, like the edges were sanded down while nobody was really paying attention. Tonight, we're going to treat that as our starting point, a calm little mystery hidden in plain sight. In this video, imagine that we're sitting together, slowly flipping through a cosmic Pokédex that stretches from Kanto all the way to Paldea. Every page is another oddly specific detail, another line of flavor text, another tiny contradiction that was never meant to keep you awake, but might be just interesting enough to carry you towards sleep. As we turn those pages, we'll move at a steady, whispery pace. No jump scares, no sudden music stings, no surprise loud moments. You can let your eyes close whenever you want. We'll still be here, talking softly about how Yamask remembers its human life, how its mask is literally its old face, and how later games quietly step back from how terrifying that idea really is. The facts stay strange. The tone stays calm. Did you know that there are pairs of Pokemon that look like evolutions, but officially aren't connected at all? Luvidisk and Alomomola share a heart-shaped silhouette, colors, even a similar role in battle. But there's no evolution line between them in any game. It's like someone tore a page out of the design document and never taped it back in. We'll drift through little puzzles like that, letting your brain chew on them just enough to stay relaxed. We're also going to spend time with softer, nostalgic details, like Pikachu's lost chubby design. Early sprites and anime art show a rounder, almost plush toy Pikachu. Over time, it was slimmed down to look more energetic for animation and marketing. Same Pokemon, different silhouette, different feeling. If you grew up with the older games, your memory and the modern artwork might not quite match, and that tiny mismatch is weirdly soothing. To untangle as you fall asleep along the way, we'll point out contradictions and scrapped ideas that only show up when you compare games, regions, or even spin-offs. Some Pokédex entries imply one thing, then a later generation quietly disagrees. Some designs echo beta content that never officially existed. None of this is dramatic or legal or about a takedown. It's just the quiet archaeology of a series that's been rewritten in tiny ways for decades. So if you want, treat this like an audio Pokédex on shuffle. We'll handle the attention to detail. You just have to listen, breathe, and let the next fact turn the page for you. So instead of chaos, let's give this whole thing a shape. Think of tonight as a slow, 3-hour walk through the regions, not a sprint. We're going to start in Kanto and then drift forward. Johto, Hoenn, all the way to Paldea, with little side paths whenever a design origin, a glitch, or some weird anime moment quietly taps us on the shoulder. That means you'll always feel a soft sense of progression. Even if you doze off halfway through Hoenn and wake up in Sinnoh, you'll know roughly where we are in the Pokemon world. One moment we're talking about Chubby, our early Pikachu sprites being slimmed down for animation. The next we're following that thread into how later games quietly retconned older art so everything looked cleaner on modern hardware. In this video, every region gets the same calm treatment. We'll mix obscure Pokédex trivia, real-world inspirations, regional differences, and those mechanical oddities that only make sense at 2 a.m. Did you know, for example, that some ghost-type entries in early generations were so blunt about death that later games quietly toned them down? We won't rush through that. We'll sit with it, then gently connect it to stuff like Yamask and Kofagrigus, hinting that some Pokémon used to be human. The voice stays steady and documentary style, even when the facts get strange. We're not here to jolt you awake with jump cuts. We're here to be the calm narrator, who also, incidentally, reads too many legal documents about fan games in their day job. If we can make cease and desist letters sound relaxing, we can definitely make Pokédex entries soothing. To keep your brain just engaged enough, every few minutes there's a light mini-hook. A simple question, like, why does Curse work completely differently on ghost types than on anything else? Or, how did Luvedisc and Alamomola end up looking like an evolution line, without actually being related? Well, little curiosities like that give your attention something soft to hold on to without snapping you out of that drifting state. We'll also keep looping back to familiar anchors, recurring Pokémon lines like Pikachu or regional bird families will reappear as we move from game to game. We'll revisit cities that show up across generations, or legends that get retold with new details. If you miss a sentence, or even a whole evolutionary line because you nodded off, it's okay. A related idea will circle back later. And as we get deeper into the night, we'll start pulling on the really strange threads, impossible Pokédex heights and weights, lore that only makes sense if you imagine a darker version of the Pokémon world, contradictions between the anime, the games, and the spin-offs. How can a creature be canonically lighter than a balloon and still cause earthquakes? Why does one region's folklore quietly disagree with another's about the same legendary? We won't answer all of that right away. For now, just know that somewhere down this 3-hour path, there's a fact about a perfectly ordinary Pokémon that might change how you see the entire series. So let's start with something that feels safe. Kanto at midnight. Lights low, Game Boy glow, and the most familiar faces in the series, quietly acting way stranger than we remember. Take Pikachu. We all know it as the mascot, but did you know that if you look at the original red and green art, Pikachu is kind of a chubby little bean? Short body, round belly, tiny arms. Over the first few years, especially once the anime took off, they slowly stretched it out. The cheeks stayed, but the body got slimmer, the neck a bit longer, the pose more athletic. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern. The design doesn't just change once, it drifts. Official art, plushies, even the way fan games draw Pikachu all quietly follow that slimmer version, as if the old one never existed. Charizard feels like the opposite. From day one, it's already the Western dragon fantasy. Horns, big bat wings, fire-breathing lizard, straight off a heavy metal album cover. But if you line that up with later dragons like Rayquaza's serpent-like body, or the more Eastern-inspired Reshiram and Zekrom, you can see the split. Charizard is the childhood picture of a dragon, almost Dungeons and Dragons by way of a 90s notebook doodle, and later generations start borrowing more from East Asian mythology, sky serpents, and divine beasts. The funny part is that Charizard still isn't even a dragon type in Kanto. Legally speaking, in the game's own rules, it's just a very enthusiastic lizard with a good PR team. Then there's Gengar, who quietly breaks the cozy nostalgia, more than almost any other Kanto Pokémon. Early Pokédex entries talk about it lurking in the shadows of people and pretending to be their shadow. And later games go further and imply that if it hides in your shadow long enough, it can literally steal your life. But that tone wobbles between generations. One entry leans into full-on horror. Another just says it likes playing pranks in the dark. You can almost feel different writers at Game Freak arguing over how scary they're allowed to make this thing in a game that also sells plush keychains. Those little contradictions pop up everywhere once you start looking. Some Kanto Pokémon are canonically lighter than a balloon, but somehow cause earthquakes or tsunamis. Heights and weights shift a bit between guides and Pokédexes. A creature that's described as able to carry off adults at night in text becomes a level 7 encounter that faints to a stray tackle. As a lawyer, I can't help thinking the risk profile here is wildly mispriced. And when we talked to translators and lore fans for this video, they all mentioned the same pattern. The really unsettling Kanto lore doesn't hit you until you compare the earliest games to the remakes and spin-offs. Ghost and psychic types especially start picking up hints of possession, memory loss, even souls trapped in objects. We won't dive all the way into that just yet, but as we move deeper into the Pokédex, the cozy midnight tour of Kanto starts to feel a little more like a haunted museum than a childhood bedroom. So if the Pokédex is a haunted museum, the ghost types are the exhibits you walk past a little faster. Did you know that the very first ghost entries in Red and Blue were way harsher than anything you'd expect from a kid's game now? Ghastly isn't just a cute gas ball. Early on, its Pokédex flat out says it can envelop an opponent and suffocate them. Haunter's entry talks about slipping through walls to lick you, and that lick causes unshakable shivering that can lead to death. Gengar? It's literally described as a shadow that posed as a human, or a creature that emerges when a traveler is lost in the mountains and dies. Later games quietly start sanding those edges down. The wording shifts toward chilling instead of lethal, stealing the warmth instead of outright killing. Like the localization team slowly dimmed the horror movie lighting without turning it off. We're going to stay calm here, but there's no way around how strange some of this is. Yamask, introduced in Unova, is one of the clearest examples. Its Pokédex says it carries a mask that used to be its human face, and that it sometimes looks at the mask and cries. That's not subtle. That's a ghost with documented grief. Cofagrigus takes that and leans into the coffin imagery, a golden sarcophagus that swallows grave robbers and turns their bodies into mummies. In later generations, especially under stricter rating boards, you can see the phrasing get more playful, but the core idea doesn't really go away. Then Galar shows up with Runerigus, and the same soul is now bound to a cursed stone slab instead of a coffin. The entries hint that the painting on its body is formed from absorbed, tortured spirits. It's basically the same tragic human backstory, reframed through regional folklore, like a legal rewrite of an old urban legend that still wants your attention. And then you have ghosts that intersect with kids in ways that are delicate, let's say. Drifloon is a friendly-looking balloon that, according to several games, tries to grab children's hands and steal them away. Later entries soften it to drifting or getting carried off, but the implication is still there if you read between the lines. It's less about jump scares and more about how, in this video, we're quietly cataloging how far the series is willing to go with a single sentence of flavor text. Outside the games, the anime and manga keep playing with that dial. The original Haunter episode turns a potentially lethal ghost into slapstick comic relief that helps Ash laugh again. Meanwhile, some manga arcs lean into full-on horror. Haunted houses, where Gengar stalks trainers, or Yamask-like spirits tied to old ruins. Different mediums, same ghosts, just different brightness settings. And ghost types don't have a monopoly on this heavier lore. Cute, harmless-looking Pokémon like Drifloon's neighbors, or even things like your favorite pink normal type, they sometimes hide flavor text that's just as eerie. We talked to fans who only noticed that years later and went, "Wait, how was that always there?" In the next section, we'll shift away from ghosts and look at a few of those deceptively adorable entries. including one that might change how you see a very famous mascot forever. So let's actually zoom in on those deceptively adorable entries, because this is where the tonal whiplash really kicks in. On the surface, a lot of these Pokémon look like plushies you'd win at a carnival. Then you read the Pokédex and realize, maybe don't give this one to a small child. Banette is the classic example. It's literally a doll that was thrown away, so full of resentment it sprang to life. Did you know some early entries say, it sticks pins in its own body to curse the person who abandoned it? Visually, it's just a zipper-mouthed gremlin with a star-shaped tail. In the text, it's basically a walking lawsuit for whoever designed that toy in-universe. You can almost imagine the in-game product recall notice. Phantump goes even further. It's a tiny stump ghost, round eyes, little leafy horns, very merchandisable. Then Kalos quietly drops the line that it's the spirit of a child who got lost in the forest and died. That's it. No follow-up, no counseling resources. Just, hey, here's your new partner. Later generations tend to restate that lore in softer ways, but the core implication never really leaves once you've seen it. And it's not just ghost types. Some fairy and normal types are doing this cute but lethal balancing act too. Mimikyu is literally designed to be pitiful. It wears a Pikachu cosplay because it wants friends. That's heartbreaking, until you read that seeing its true form can cause a mysterious, possibly fatal illness. Beware looks like a huggable mascot suit. And then Alola tells us it can accidentally crush people to death when it's being affectionate. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that contrast. The art team hands you a plush. The writers quietly slip in a horror short story. Over time, you can watch the dial move. Early haunted object concepts like Banette, or even the Yamask line, lean very hard into, this was a person, and something went wrong. Later gens remix the same ideas with a more playful tone. Poltergeist, spilling tea instead of souls. Sinistea worrying about being counterfeit. Stuff like that. It's still spooky, but the camera cuts away a little earlier. Localization nudges that camera too. In Japanese, a phrase might lean into folklore about vengeful spirits or wandering children. In English, it sometimes becomes a lighter metaphor, or the mention of death is swapped for disappearing or getting lost. We talked to translators who described it as a constant judgment call. How creepy is too creepy for a kid's game? And how much do you owe to the original myth? Pattern interrupt here. Not every scary-looking Pokémon is actually dangerous. In the next section, we're going to flip this around and look at the ones that seem terrifying or overpowered at first glance, but whose lore turns out to be strangely gentle or even quietly tragic, including one you've probably had on your team since your very first playthrough. So let's flip that lens all the way around. Did you know that some of the most intimidating Pokémon in the entire series have Pokédex entries that read less like horror stories and more like oddly soothing bedtime blurbs? Big spikes, heavy armor, sky-high attack stats. And then you actually read the lore and realize, oh, this thing just wants to babysit a mountain. Take Tyranitar. Visually, it looks like the kind of Pokémon Nintendo would put on the box if they wanted parents to pay attention and maybe worry a little. It's enormous. It's armored. It can literally reshape landscapes in the games. But the Pokédex keeps circling back to the same idea. It's not rampaging for fun. It's defending its territory, almost like a living landslide that decided one valley is home, and nothing is allowed to bother it, or the smaller Pokémon inside. In the anime, they lean into that. We get Tyranitar as a protective parent figure. Slow-moving, low-voiced, more like a grumpy park ranger than a villain. Agron follows the same pattern. On paper, it's a steel-type battering ram. In practice, its entries describe it as the guardian of mountains and forests, patiently replanting trees after landslides and caring about erosion more than most real-world governments. We're told it marks off its territory, yes, but it also repairs environmental damage, which is a very different vibe from the usual kaiju narrative. In this video, we're going to keep seeing that contrast. Designs that scream boss battle, and text that whispers National Park Service. And then there's Gudra, which almost feels like a joke at my expense as a lawyer, with a supposedly calm voice. You finally get a dragon pseudo-legendary, statistically terrifying in battle, and the lore says it cries easily. It's incredibly sensitive, and it's fiercely loyal to the people and Pokémon it trusts. In a genre where dragons are usually ancient, aloof weapons of mass destruction, Gudra is written like an anxious friend who will absolutely hug you too long and then one-shot anything that made you sad. The anime doubles down with that soft, almost sleepy vocal performance, slow movements, and those long, clingy embraces. If you've ever wanted emotional support in the form of a slime dragon, the series quietly hands it to you. This gentle giant thing isn't just for regular species either. Legendary and mythical Pokémon often come wrapped in disaster imagery, but their core stories are about balance. Lugia sleeps in the deep sea, not because it hates the world, but because flapping its wings too hard can cause storms, so it chooses isolation to protect everyone else. Celebi, instead of rewriting history in some dramatic time travel thriller, spends its screen time healing forests and restoring little pockets of nature, almost like a wandering conservation nonprofit with leaf hands. The anime and movies love turning that into a visual lullaby. Huge, dangerous silhouettes move slowly, speak softly, and spend more time shielding kids or rebuilding forests than actually fighting. Battle stats say threat. Animation says guardian. It's the same universe, just framed from a different emotional angle. So if you're somehow still awake with us, which scary Pokémon have you always secretly found comforting? The one whose roar sounds, in your head, a little bit like a lullaby? In the next section, we're going to drift from gentle guardians to something stranger. The Pokémon whose lore quietly changed over time, as if the Pokédex itself was trying to tuck us in. But sometimes, when the Pokédex is trying to tuck us in, it accidentally leaves the light on, and you can see the wires. Did you know that, on paper, the Pokémon world quietly breaks its own physics every few pages? Not in the fun fire horse beats grass dinosaur way, but in the this entry would literally erase a continent way. As we slow down here, we're going to look at the numbers that don't add up, the measurements that read more like campfire stories than a field guide. You've probably heard a few of the classics, tiny ghost and dark types that can supposedly drag off full-grown adults. Something like Phantump, which is only 1.5 feet tall, being described as luring people into forests and stealing their life force. Or Gengar, standing in for a traveler and killing them in their shadow. Then you have Pokémon that swallow cars whole, whip up storms, or cause natural disasters big enough to realistically reshape entire regions. If half of those entries were literally true all at once, there wouldn't be much Pokémon world left. When you actually line up the height and weight stats with the feats, it gets even stranger. There are Pokédex lines about a Pokémon as light as a house cat, throwing people, boulders, or even mountains around. Meanwhile, we have things like Wailord, officially 47 feet long, but only about 877 pounds. Fans did the math and realized that makes it less dense than air, basically a blimp disguised as a whale. Magcargo's body temperature is given as hotter than the surface of the sun. If that were real, one of them would sterilize an entire region just by existing, and yet in the game they politely sit in caves, waiting for you to throw pokeballs. The deeper you go, the more these contradictions turn into a kind of bedtime puzzle. Dreepy is said to fly at speeds over 200 miles per hour when launched by Dragapult, which, if you calculate the impact, turns a cute animation into a small ballistic missile. There are bug types that allegedly shred steel, but way less than your laptop. As a lawyer, I'm used to reading documents that technically make sense, but the Pokédex sometimes feels like a contract drafted by a very excited 10-year-old. So fans started trying to fix it. Whole threads, videos, and even fan games reinterpret these entries as myths, tall tales, or in-universe exaggerations. Maybe professors are quoting scared villagers. Maybe kids submitted the data. Some people treat the Pokédex like a collection of folklore, where Magcargo isn't literally star-hot. It's just unbearably hot, in the way your laptop could fry an egg when it's actually just annoying. In this video, we talk to people who treat those contradictions as features, not bugs. They'll write headcanons where Gengar's kills people line is an old superstition, or Wailord's density is a measuring error from outdated equipment. It's a surprisingly cozy way to read the games. Every impossible number is a story someone once told. And this matters, because later in the series, the Pokédex doesn't just bend physics, it bends entire storylines. Regions quietly disagree with each other about history. Legendary Pokémon change jobs between games, and one particular myth flips completely depending on who you ask. We'll get there. For now, as you drift, try to imagine. If the numbers are this inconsistent, what happens when the legends themselves start to move? When the legends start to move, the lines between canon and almost canon get blurry. Did you know there's an entire shadow layer of Pokémon that technically exist, but only in old demos, pitch documents, and half-finished sprites buried on development carts? In the same way, the Pokédex quietly contradicts itself. The designs do too. Early on, Game Freak would sketch dozens of creatures for every one that actually made it into a game. Some survived only as rough pixel art in prototypes like the famous Gold and Silver Space World demo. Others in concept sheets shown for a few seconds at events, and a few more slipped out years later in art books and leaks. They're beta Pokémon in the literal sense. Trial versions of ideas, frozen mid-evolution. We're going to stay gentle here, but the details are surprisingly vivid. The Space World demo alone has an entire alternate Johto roster. A very different Fire-type starter line, a shark-like pre-evolution for Gyarados, and a strange, almost plush version of what would become Girafarig, with a full second head instead of just a tail face. Some of these designs feel like cousins of the Pokémon we know, sharing a silhouette or a color scheme, but not quite matching any final species. Sometimes the beta and the final design are like two branches of the same tree. Pikachu, for example, originally had a much chubbier body and softer curves. And over time, they trimmed it down for animation, made the cheeks brighter, and sharpened the ears so it would read instantly from a distance. In old Gen 1 sprites, you can still see that rounder, toy-like version peeking through. Other times, ideas were split apart and reassigned. Love Disc looks like it should evolve into Alomomola, but they're separate because the heart-shaped Lovefish concept and the larger Sunfish body plan ended up in different generations. Here's a little pattern interrupt for your half-asleep brain. There's a beta Pokémon that looks like a chainsaw bear. Imagine rolling over at 3 a.m., booting up a demo, and finding that thing instead of Teddy Ursa. As a lawyer, I'm quietly relieved that one never had to be explained to a rating board. Even when Nintendo cut these designs from the official games, fans didn't let them vanish. ROM hackers reinsert Space World monsters into custom builds. Fan games treat unused evolutions and weird prototypes as full members of the regional decks. On art sites, you'll see entire beta dexes, where people redraw those sketchy sprites, smooth the anatomy, and invent Pokédex entries, movesets, and relationships. In this video, we talk to a few artists who basically treat beta Pokémon as residents of a parallel universe Johto, living right next door to the one you remember. And every so often, those shadows step into the light. A scrapped sea slug concept from early Diamond and Pearl, quietly resurfaced later as Shellos and Gastrodon. Unused regional ideas show up years later as new forms, new legends, or whole new regions. The most interesting beta concepts don't really die. They just wait. In the next sections, we're going to follow a few of those ghosts as they reappear, disguised as brand new Pokémon you've been catching for years. Those ghosts of old ideas don't just come back as new regions. A lot of them were hiding in plain sight from the very beginning, inside the most basic-looking Pokémon. Did you know that some of the most iconic Kanto and Johto designs started as really simple animals on a sketch page, and then quietly absorbed centuries of folklore? Think about how many early Pokémon are just a thing you could doodle in the margins of your math homework. Pidgey is a little bird. Magikarp is a fish. Rattata is a mouse that's had way too much caffeine. That simplicity wasn't laziness, it was strategy. On the Game Boy's tiny screen, in a game kids were playing half asleep in the back of a car, you needed instantly readable silhouettes. So designers leaned on shapes you already knew by heart, then slipped in tiny twists from Japanese stories and urban legends. Take Ninetales. On the surface, it's just a fancy fox evolution you might stick on your team because it looks cool. Underneath, it's the classic nine-tailed fox spirit, the kitsune. Old tales say these foxes gain tails as they grow wiser and more powerful, live for 1,000 years, and curse anyone who mistreats them. The Pokédex quietly mirrors all of that. Mentions of a 1,000-year lifespan, mystical energy in each tale, and that famous line about laying a curse on anyone who grabs one. That's not random, spooky flavor text. It's folklore being smuggled through a cartridge. Vulpix does the same thing in miniature. It starts with 6 tails that are said to split and grow more numerous as it ages, like a baby kitsune, slowly leveling up into a full-blown legend. You're not just evolving a Pokémon, you're fast-forwarding a myth. And it's not just foxes. Designs like Sintret and Furret echo stories of shape-shifting tanuki, the raccoon dogs that show up in Japanese myths as mischievous, stretchy, slightly chaotic spirits. Early sprites couldn't show a full Studio Ghibli-style transformation sequence, so they focused on big eyes, ringed tails, and playful animations to hint at that energy instead. At the same time, Game Freak was looking west. Machamp is basically a wrestling superhero, all championship belt and exaggerated muscles, like a Silver Age comic book wandered into the Pokédex. Alakazam leans into stage magician imagery, spoons, mustache, cape-like collar. Underneath, it's drawing from psychic folklore, and even a few spoon-bending celebrity psychics. But on a dot matrix screen, buff hero and mysterious magician read a lot faster than a nuanced anthropology paper. As a lawyer, I can confirm, nobody is falling asleep to a nuanced anthropology paper. At least not on purpose. Those hardware limits mattered. With just a handful of pixels and colors, Designers picked creatures and myths that could be boiled down into bold, iconic shapes. Birds, rodents, snakes, simple ghosts, plus a few cultural archetypes like wrestlers and wizards. The more complicated ideas had to wait. In this video, we're going to follow that evolution. We've seen how grounded animals and old stories became Kanto and Johto's backbone. Next, we'll watch the series get weirder as later generations turn traffic cones, ice cream, and even abstract concepts into Pokémon that somehow still feel alive. How do you go from Ninetales to a sentient trash bag and make it work? That's where we're headed. So let's talk about the moment Pokémon stops being about animals, and suddenly your sword is trying to kill you. Did you know that Honage's Pokédex entries literally warn you not to grab its hilt, because it'll wrap its blue cloth around your arm and drain your life force? That's not subtle. As that line evolves into Doublade, and then Aegislash, the lore zooms out from one haunted weapon to an entire political history. Aegislash is said to have chosen kings, to sense the hearts of people, and to bring entire nations to ruin when the wrong ruler took power. In one line, they blend medieval warfare, ghost stories, and constitutional law, which, as a lawyer, I have to admit, is a pretty efficient way to explain why you don't want a cursed sword in your cabinet. Those entries are doing something clever. On the surface, it's just a cool ghost/steel type that sweeps teams with King's Shield and stance changes. Underneath, it's a commentary on how tools of war outlast the people who wield them. The blade is still here. The kings are gone. And the game quietly asks you, who's really in charge, the monarch or the weapon that chooses them? Once you notice that, the rest of the living objects start to feel less random. Chandelure isn't just a chandelier. It's a chandelier that, according to some early entries, burns away spirits and leaves bodies behind, which is a little intense for a thing you hang in a dining room. Rotom takes it in a different direction. It jumps into TVs, microwaves, lawnmowers, basically your entire house, like a One Ghost fan game about smart appliances going rogue. Klefki is literally a key ring that collects keys it likes, and somehow, that tiny behavior makes it feel more real than a lot of generic RPG ghosts. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that idea. Objects as memory. Modern life is full of stuff like that. Old phones full of photos. House keys for apartments you don't live in anymore. The games quietly tap into that. Rotom forms mirror our relationship with technology. Chandelure feels like an heirloom that's seen generations come and go. Klefki is that drawer of keys your parents refuse to throw away, now with a fairy typing. When these designs first showed up, a lot of fans pushed back. We're talking, they're out of ideas. It's just garbage bags and ice cream now, levels of outrage. But over time, as animations, competitive roles, and side material filled in the gaps, people warmed up. Aegislash became a serious threat in tournaments. Rotom Wash turned into a metagame staple. Chandelure got anime moments, spooky merch, the works. Once the lore and the gameplay caught up, the keyring and the haunted lamp started to feel less like jokes and more like deliberate world building. And this is just the basic version. Some of the most elaborate object designs don't even show up until regional variants start treating the same Pokémon as totally different artifacts, depending on the culture around them. What happens when a ghost sword isn't a sword anymore? Or when a mask becomes a tablet of stone instead of a sarcophagus? We're about to get into that shift next, and the places it almost went, but never made it into the final game. So when a sword stops being a sword, or a mask turns into a stone tablet, we've quietly crossed into one of the strangest ideas in modern Pokémon design: regional variants. Did you know it? For the first 20 years of the series, a Kanto Rattata was just a Kanto Rattata, no matter where you met it? Then Alola shows up and basically says, what if we treated old Pokémon like local wildlife, instead of fixed icons? Same species name, different climate, different culture, different history. And suddenly, you have Alolan Vulpix trading fire for ice because it fled to snowy mountains, or Alolan Exeggutor stretching into a palm tree that looks like it lost a bet with gravity. The game is quietly asking you to imagine parallel worlds where evolution took a left turn. Galar pushes that even further by leaning into folklore. Regular Ponyta and Rapidash are fiery racehorses, straight out of a classic fantasy RPG. They're hot-blooded, literally, built around speed, flames, and that very 90s cool horse but on fire energy. Galarian Ponyta, though, is a completely different story. A pastel forest spirit with a mane that looks like it drifted out of a children's book about fairies. Its Pokédex entries talk about absorbing the life energy of the forest, not burning anything down. Rapidash stops being a living comet and becomes a unicorn that feels like it wandered in from Arthurian legend. What's wild is that the typing follows the lore instead of the other way around. Fire turns into pure psychic, then fairy. Because in Galar, the inspiration isn't racehorses and speedways. It's misty woods, Celtic myths, and stories about mysterious creatures only children can see. We're looking at the same evolutionary line, but the region's culture is basically acting like a filter over the design. Alolan Marowak might be the clearest example of that. In Kanto, Cubone's story is already dark, wearing its mother's skull, grieving, all that stuff. Alola doesn't just reskin it, they turn that grief into ritual. Now Marowak is fire/ghost, spinning its bone like a flaming baton in a funeral dance. Its Pokédex entries reference fire dancers and protective spirits, echoing real Polynesian fire knife performances. The same tragedy, but reframed as a cultural practice instead of a one-off horror story. If this sounds a little like real-world biogeography, that's because it is. The idea that the same animal can evolve into totally different forms on different islands is textbook Darwin. But Pokémon adds myths, festivals, and local superstition on top. Every regional variant is basically a tiny alternate universe where one design meeting went differently. Here's the pattern interrupt. Once you notice that, you can't unsee it. You start realizing that in this video, we're going to keep bumping into parallel versions of the same Pokémon, not just across regions but across media. The anime's Brock, the manga's Brock, the game's Brock. They're almost regional variants of a person. So next, instead of Alolan or Galarian forms, we're going to look at how the anime, manga, and spin-off games quietly create media variants of the same characters, reshaping their personalities and stories the way regions reshape their designs. No legal takedown needed, just different storytellers deciding who these Pokémon really are. And nowhere is that media variant idea louder than in the anime. Which is funny, because it usually whispers its changes instead of announcing them. Did you know that if you only knew Jigglypuff from the games, you'd expect a mildly terrifying sleep weapon, not a recurring Sharpie-based comedy bit? In the Pokédex, Sing is this battlefield control move that can knock out an entire team. In the show, we're going to watch it knock out entire crowds, sure. But the punchline is always the same. Jigglypuff gets ignored, gets mad, and vandalizes everyone's faces. The dangerous soporific becomes frustrated street artist. The anime takes a status move and turns it into character motivation. That's the bigger pattern. The games treat most Pokémon as templates, with a couple of stats and a paragraph of flavor. The anime turns them into coworkers with HR issues. Ash's Charizard isn't just high attack, low obedience in a menu. It goes from disobedient hothead to traumatized rival to dependable ace, with entire arcs about trust and training that never show up in any official Pokédex entry. Pikachu's refusal to evolve into Raichu does the same thing. In-game, evolution is a button press. In the show, it's a values debate about identity, strength, and whether you really have to optimize everything just because you can. As a lawyer, I feel obligated to say, in the anime, informed consent actually matters. Once you start looking, the contradictions get pretty wild. The show constantly hands out moves that don't exist on the Learn Set menu. Pikachu pulls off things that look a lot like Volt Tackle years before. That's a legal move in the game. Bulbasaur whips out Vine Whip and Razor Leaf, in combinations you can't input. And half the cast is doing acrobatics that would get you disqualified in a battle simulator. Habitat rules bend too. We see Pokémon like Cyndaquil and other supposedly rare Johto species just hanging out in places where the regional deck says they shouldn't be. Or ghost types casually drifting around busy cities that, in the games, only get one haunted building. And those ghost and psychic types are where the tone shift really shows. Early Pokédex entries talk about things like spirits stealing children, or Yamask remembering its human life. In the anime, that's usually softened into mischievous pranks, lonely backstories, and we just wanted a friend episodes. Haunter becomes a slapstick sidekick for Sabrina instead of a horror monster. And even when a Drifloon or a Mismagius gets creepy, the camera cuts away before it hits full folklore nightmare. If you're an older viewer, you can still see the original myth peeking through, but it's framed like a campfire story instead of a legal warning label. What's interesting is that other media sometimes go the opposite way. The manga and certain spin-off games lean into the darker implications the anime dodges, with battles that draw blood, Pokémon that actually die, and legendaries treated more like natural disasters than collectible pets. In this video, we'll drift over there next and quietly compare how far those versions are willing to go when nobody has to worry about Saturday morning broadcast standards. So once you step off the Saturday morning sidewalk, the first place you usually land is the Pokémon Adventures manga. Did you know that in those pages, the world we think we know gets quietly upgraded from Pet Battle League to something much closer to a natural disaster simulator with gym badges? Adventures treats Pokémon as dangerous animals and forces of nature first, collectibles second. Trainers get knocked out, bleed, and end up in the hospital. Pokémon are frozen solid, sliced, or turned to stone, and the story actually sits with that instead of cutting to a comedy reaction shot. When legendary Pokémon show up, they don't just pose dramatically for a Pokéball. They rearrange oceans, burn down forests, and threaten entire regions in a way the main games only hint at in flavor text. There's an arc where Kyogre and Groudon clash, and it's not a scripted cutscene you mash A through. It's a city-level crisis, with people evacuating and trainers wondering if using their teams in the crossfire is brave or reckless. Another plotline has a villain using Deoxys as a living weapon, and the real tension isn't just will they win the battle, it's whether the heroes can treat this traumatized Pokémon as a person instead of a tool. Power and responsibility stop being abstract themes and turn into actual choices on the page. We're going to stay vague here. There's both because spoilers and because this is still a sleep video, but the pattern is clear. The same basic world, just with the safety rails taken off. A gym leader might be a disaster response specialist, not just a guy waiting in a room with weird statues. An Elite Four member might be closer to a secret agent than a glorified tournament arc boss. Once you see that version, it's hard not to glance back at the games and wonder what's happening just off-screen. Spin-off games quietly do the same thing. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon looks cute, but it's basically a guided tour of existential crises in pastel colors. You wake up as a Pokémon with no memory, get told you used to be human, and then spend the whole game asking, who was I? And does that still matter? Entire towns of Pokémon gossip, form rescue teams, argue about prophecy, and panic over apocalyptic weather patterns. The big questions aren't, what's the best type matchup, but what am I for? And can you escape the role destiny handed you? Not bad for a game where your partner is a nervous Psyduck or an overexcited Torchic. Stories like that quietly rewire how you see individual species. A background monster from Route 1 becomes the partner who talks you through a panic attack in a cave. A supposedly scary ghost type turns out to be the one making jokes to keep everyone calm before the final dungeon. After you've seen a Skitty run a cafe or a Wigglytuff lead a guild, it's hard to go back to thinking of them as random encounter number 3. In this video, we talk to developers and translators about how these side stories sometimes influence the mainline scripts in tiny, almost invisible ways. A single line in a Pokédex entry, a throwaway NPC comment, a location name that quietly references an old manga arc. So as we drift back toward the core games, we're going to start watching for those seams in the universe, those places where it feels like the darker multiverse is leaking in at the edges. And in the next section, one very ordinary route, one extremely normal town, and one almost deleted NPC are going to make that feeling a lot harder to ignore. And once you've seen one quiet NPC almost break the universe, you start noticing all the other places where the world looks like it's been patched over. Did you know there are whole civilizations in Pokémon that basically only exist as crumbling stone and half-translated text boxes? We're going to start in Johto, at the ruins of Alph. On the surface, it's just an optional detour off Route 32. No boss fight, no big cutscene, no legal obligation from the game to drag you there. But if you walk in, the music drops into that echoing drone, the colors wash out, and suddenly you're in a different kind of Pokémon story. One where someone built a temple just to stare at unknown and hope they didn't stare back. The puzzles in those chambers are jigsaw murals of Pokémon that shouldn't even exist in Johto yet. Kabuto, Omanite, Aerodactyl, Ho-Oh. When you solve them, the floor literally drops out. The walls are covered in unknown script, spelling out things like, "Our clan created Pokémon," and "We are all one." That's not subtle. That's a long-dead culture, quietly claiming they made living creatures, and the game just never follows up. Unknown themselves are one of the strangest design choices in the series. They're living letters, but the Pokédex keeps hinting they're more like fragments of a language older than any region. Entries talk about them arranging themselves to form ancient words, or that when they gather, reality starts to warp. In the Alph puzzles, you literally read with them. In later games, they show up in secret rooms and event maps, like they're punctuation marks on history. It's the one time the Pokémon world admits, out loud, that language might be a kind of psychic force. Then Sinnoh quietly raises the stakes. The Sinjo ruins, that hidden event area you could only reach with a special Arceus, feel like a legal crossover between Johto and Sinnoh's mythologies. Stone circles, mixed architecture styles, a shrine that lets you create a legendary just by remembering it. The game never names the people who built it. You're standing in a fusion of cultures that no longer exist, with a god Pokémon rewriting reality, and the NPCs treat it like a weird vacation spot. Over in Hoenn and Sinnoh again, The Regis take that same idea and make it scarier. Their chambers are locked behind Braille inscriptions, which, if you're a kid in 2003, might be the first time you realize Braille is even a thing. The text talks about giants sealed away, dangerous power that had to be locked underground, instructions to literally wait 2 minutes in a room, or bring specific Pokémon as offerings. It's ritual. It's also the closest Pokémon gets to saying previous civilizations were terrified of what they made, so they buried it. What's wild is how optional all of this is. None of these ruins are on the critical path. The games never flash a big arrow saying, lore this way. You only find the Unknown Chambers, the Regi puzzles, the Sinjo ruins if you wander, backtrack, or read suspicious Braille like a lawyer reading a contract for hidden clauses. The reward isn't a broken item or a competitive edge. It's the feeling that the map is bigger than the story you were told. And just when you think all the good secrets are carved in stone, the games pull a quiet trick. Some of the strangest lore in Pokémon isn't in ruins at all. It's buried in move descriptions and mechanics that don't quite behave the way they're advertised. In the next section, we're going to look at attacks that act possessed, abilities that remember past lives, and one move that changes its own rules depending on who's using it, and why that might be the clearest window into how this universe actually works. So let's start with that move that literally refuses to follow its own rules. Curse. Did you know that for most Pokémon, Curse is basically a slow, emo stat buff, but the second a ghost type uses it, the move completely rewrites itself? On a normal Pokémon, you trade speed for higher attack and defense. On a ghost, you stab your own HP in half and lay a draining hex on the opponent instead. That's not a balance tweak. That's theology, baked into code. The game never sits you down and says, ghosts in this world fight by sacrificing their own life force. But that's exactly what the mechanic is telling you. Ghost types don't just hit you, they bind you. They pay a price up front, then watch you slowly crumble. It's a totally different relationship to power. And the only way you learn it is by using the move and noticing that the description quietly lies. Once you start looking, you see that same pattern everywhere in ghost moves. Destiny Bond is basically a legal contract written by a vengeful spirit. If I faint, you're coming with me. Perish Song turns the whole battlefield into a countdown, where everyone, even the singer, is doomed on the same timer. Grudge doesn't hurt your HP at all. It erases the PP of the move that knocked you out. Like the Pokémon's resentment is literally clogging up that attack so it can't be used again. In other words, the Ghost Toolkit is revenge, shared fate, and lingering hatred, expressed as turn-by-turn rules. You don't need a cutscene about the afterlife. The competitive players figure it out the hard way when their sweeper goes down because they got greedy into a Destiny Bond, and suddenly they're reading flavor text, like it's a court judgment. As a lawyer, I have to respect a move that says, "You were warned," and then enforces its own fine print. And it's not just spooky stuff like that. Signature moves for legendaries are basically miniature creation myths. Palkia's Spatial Rend and Dialga's Roar of Time don't just hit hard. Their descriptions talk about tearing space and warping time, echoing Sinnoh's story that these Pokémon shaped the universe. In Kalos, Geomancy on Xerneas is framed like awakening ancient life energy, while Yveltal's Oblivion Wing literally steals vitality, matching the legend that it absorbs all life when it spreads its wings. Even abilities read like personality notes. Levitate isn't just immune to ground. It tells you this Pokémon lives above the earth. Maybe psychic, maybe spectral, maybe just refusing to touch the polluted ground. Intimidate implies a presence so overwhelming, foes start weaker before a single blow is thrown. Mummy spreads like a curse and doubles, overriding other abilities, as if contact with this ancient body erases who you were. In this video, we're going to keep zooming in on places where the rules whisper stories like this. But next, we'll flip the script. What happens when the mechanics weren't meant to say anything at all? Yet glitches, bad code, and half-finished ideas accidentally create new legends that get more attention than the official lore. So if the last section was about rules that quietly tell stories, this one is about when the rules just fall apart. And somehow, that brokenness starts talking louder than anything in the official lore. Did you know that for a whole generation of players, missing number felt less like a bug and more like a ghost that lived inside the cartridge? On paper, it's simple. The Game Boy only had so much memory. The Pokémon team used shortcuts to squeeze in 151 monsters, items, map data, battle routines. And the game sometimes tried to read Pokémon data from places that weren't meant to hold it. In practice, you surf along Cinnabar's coast, the screen flickers, and suddenly there's this scrambled bird skeleton thing screaming out of the void. We're going to be honest. As a kid, you don't think, yes, array bounds and pointer tables. You think, I've found a secret Pokémon Nintendo doesn't want me to see. Missing no. The glitched trainer with 6 Slowkings, and the Hall of Fame turning into a nightmare collage of wrong sprites. These all came from the same place. The game reusing memory and trusting the player to never poke it at weird angles. Players, of course, immediately poked. Before anyone was explaining this on YouTube or data mining ROMs, the playground lore machine spun up. People traded handwritten guides about Pokegods, secret evolutions, hidden areas beyond the edge of the map. Someone's cousin swore that if you talked to the old man, you surfed the coast, and did a bunch of very specific menu tricks, you could unlock Mew 3. Another kid insisted their copy was haunted because the music slowed down and the sprites melted after they caught missing no. We talked to fans who still remember being afraid to save, as if the glitch could somehow escape the cartridge and corrupt the whole Game Boy. And it wasn't just big headline glitches. Generation 1 is full of smaller, strangely intimate errors. Moves that behave in ways the text doesn't quite match. Critical hit rates that don't line up with what the manual promised. Sprites that look a little off, like someone drew them from memory in a hurry. There are audio bugs where a battle theme fails to load correctly and leaves you in this oddly quiet, half-broken soundscape. Late at night, with that green Game Boy screen glow, that silence feels way more eerie than any scripted horror event. Later games quietly started winking at all this. Did you notice how some Pokédex entries and NPC lines feel like they're nodding to ghost data without saying it out loud? Glitch-style Pokémon in fan games, Rotom messing with electronics, ultra wormholes tearing open reality. None of these are literal missing no, but they live in the same emotional space. Even the way modern games handle out-of-bounds areas or invisible walls feels like a response to decades of players trying to slip through the cracks. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that conversation between players and the code. Sometimes the ghosts are accidents, but not always. Regional differences, censorship, and localization tweaks hide their own intentional mysteries. Lines changed, jokes added, even whole events shifted depending on where you bought the game. So what happens when the glitch isn't a bug at all, but a secret only one language gets to see? Sometimes that secret is literally a single sentence. Did you know that within the same generation, two versions can't even agree on what a Pokémon is like as a person? One Pokédex calls it gentle, the other basically says, do not approach without safety goggles. Take Gengar. In one game, it's framed as a mischievous shadow that just likes playing pranks. In another, it pretends to be your shadow and silently waits for the right moment. Same species, same region, but the behavior slides from playful to almost predatory, depending on which cartridge you bought. Yamask is even harsher. Early entries in one version lean into the tragedy of a human soul remembering its past life, while another version downplays the human angle and focuses on the mask as a cursed artifact instead. And that's before we even cross languages. In Japanese, a lot of these entries are a little more direct, a little less softened around the edges. We're going to stay cozy here. But for example, the Japanese text for some ghost types leans harder into ideas of lost spirits and funerary rituals, while the English version shifted towards spooky but fun Halloween energy. Where the original might allude to specific folklore, the localization team swaps in a more generic metaphor, so you don't need a degree in Shinto studies to follow along. The same thing happens with names and jokes. In this video, we've already seen how translators quietly rewrite culture. Here it's on full display. A move that's a pun on a Japanese proverb might become a reference to a nursery rhyme. A town rumor that originally mentions real-world religion gets scrubbed into something about mysterious energy instead. We talked to one former translator who described it as running a tiny diplomacy mission in every text box. That's not legal work, but as a lawyer, I have to admit, it sounds familiar. Sometimes the Japanese suggest something darker or more complex, but the English script backs away. Early entries for a certain psychic-type hint that its powers emerged under intense stress. Later, English versions recast that as simple, strong will. Jinx's Japanese descriptions once leaned more into mythological spirit imagery, while international versions emphasized dancing and performance to pull attention away from real-world controversy. And it's not just words. Parallel games create parallel histories. One version gets an in-game event with a special item and a short side quest about a forgotten trainer. The sister version replaces it with a different NPC and a different story beat. Limited time distributions, region-locked items, even a single building that only opens in one version, all add up to slightly different timelines for the same region. That's the quiet layer. The next one is loud. Once we leave text behind, those differences turn into whole new bodies. Regional forms, split evolutions, and ancient or future variants that only exist in certain eras. If a sentence can change a personality, what happens when an entire form is exclusive to one region's history? And sometimes, those new bodies don't line up the way you'd expect. Evolution is supposed to be this clean, satisfying ladder. But in Pokémon, half the fun is when the ladder is missing a few rungs. Did you know there are pairs that look obviously related, share types, share vibes, and the games just insist, legally speaking, that they are strangers? Luvedisc and Alomomola might be the most famous. Same pink heartfish silhouette, same general habitat, same heels-tired swimmers flavor. For years, people assumed Gen 5 finally gave Luvedisc the evolution it deserved. But there's no line, no baby, no middle stage. Just two separate entries, like someone cut the connecting arrow in a design document and never pasted it back. Fans have basically built a whole shadow Pokédex of scrapped evolutions out of pairs like that. Druddigon and the Gen 8 fossil dragons, Tropius and Meganium, Dunsparce and, well, until Dunsparce showed up, pretty much anything. In this video, we're going to keep running into spots where you can feel a missing link that never made it past the planning stage. Game Freak almost never comments, but concept art, internal indexes, and unused moves sometimes hint that those gaps weren't accidents, just casualties of time and cartridge space. Then there are the lines that did get patched later. When Pichu arrived in Gen 2, it quietly rewrote our memory of Kanto. Suddenly, Pikachu wasn't just a mascot, it was a middle child. The anime retconned in baby pictures, the games added breeding, and the whole line shifted from electric mouse to family of electric mice that imprint on trainers. Magnezone does the same thing in reverse. Magnemite and Magneton used to feel complete. Now they read like a halfway point in a technological arms race, with the UFO final form only achievable in specific regions. Branching evolutions are where the biology textbook really starts arguing with itself. Gloom into Vileplume or Bellossom is a great example. On one side, a toxic Rafflesia flower that spreads spores and status conditions. On the other, a sunny hula flower that dances, purifies, and lives in different climates. Their Pokédex entries read like two separate ecological strategies: weaponize poison, or win by photosynthesis and charm. You can almost imagine two professors in-universe publishing rival papers about what Gloom is supposed to become. A lot of the evolution methods feel intentionally symbolic too. Trading a Haunter to get a Gengar turns a personal bond into a social mechanic. You literally can't complete that ghost story without another person. Holding a Razor Claw at night, leveling up near a magnetic field, evolving in a mossy rock cave, or a specific city with strong emotions in the lore. Those aren't just puzzles, they're little myths about how place and ritual shape a Pokemon's destiny. As a lawyer, I appreciate that some of these conditions are more convoluted than actual contract clauses. And yet, some of the strangest changes don't care about level-up charts at all. Regional forms, convergent species, and the paradox Pokémon in Paldea take that neat evolutionary tree and twist it through time and space. In a minute, we'll look at what happens when evolution stops being linear growth and turns into alternate timelines sharing the same name tag. So let's follow that twist all the way into Paldea, where evolution stops being a family tree and starts looking like a conspiracy board. Paradox Pokémon are the moment the games basically say, what if your Donphan is also a dinosaur tank and a cyberpunk murder wheel at the same time? They share a name tag, but everything else feels like someone split the timeline and refused to pick one version. In Scarlet, we get the ancient ones: Great Tusk, Screamtail, Brute Bonnet. Their designs exaggerate the bits that feel prehistoric. Huge tusks, shaggy fur, spikes everywhere, like they walked out of a fake fossil exhibit. In Violet, it's the opposite. Iron treads, Iron Valiant, Iron Bundle, smooth metal, LED eyes, hovering parts, like sci-fi fan games that accidentally got pushed to the main server. Did you know that in the code and the marketing, they're very careful not to just call these prehistoric or robot versions? It's always resembling a Pokémon or described in a mysterious journal. That wording matters. A lot of the Pokédex entries in Paldea are written like nervous lab notes, not confident encyclopedia facts. It is said to be, some theorize, according to an expedition record. The game keeps putting distance between the researcher and the creature, like even the in-universe scientists are afraid to say what they're looking at. We're used to Pokédex exaggerations, but this is different. This is institutional doubt. As a lawyer, I'm used to reading documents that hedge like that when nobody wants legal responsibility for being wrong. And this isn't the first time Pokemon has played with time as something flexible. Celebi has been hopping through eras since the Game Boy Color, literally dragging the player into the past in the Ilex Forest event. Dialga doesn't just represent time, it canonically controls it, rewinding, accelerating, and distorting history in the anime and in Mystery Dungeon. Those Mystery Dungeon games go even harder. Entire plots about preventing a ruined future, like characters fading out of existence when the timeline changes, stuff like that. In this video, we're going to keep seeing that pattern. The more they talk about time, the less stable reality gets. So when Paradox Pokemon show up, fans immediately start asking, are these really ancestors and descendants? Or something weirder? One theory says they're myths made real by the terrarium machine, like the Scarlet Book and Violet Book illustrations being wish fulfillment, not field notes. Another theory treats them as products of alternate timelines bleeding into Paldea, which would neatly explain why no fossil record, no prior sightings, nothing. We talked to lore-obsessed players who point out that the professor's research is framed almost like a cover story, which is very on brand for a company that never wants to fully pin down canon. And if time can bend this much, what about space? Because just when you get used to ancient Jigglypuff and future Delibird, the series starts dropping creatures that don't even feel like they belong in the same universe. Ultra Beasts, extra-dimensional legendaries, entities that show up like a cosmic DMCA takedown on reality itself. In a moment, we're going to leave the Paradox Caverns behind and open the wormhole to the Ultra Beasts, where the question stops being, when did this Pokemon come from? And turns into, should this thing exist here at all? And when we step through that wormhole, the rules bend a little. Ultra Beasts aren't just rare Pokemon. They're officially classified as UB01, UB02, and so on. Like someone at the Ether Foundation had to open a brand new spreadsheet just to keep track of how wrong these things feel. Did you know that in the Alola games, the Pokédex doesn't really understand Ultra Beasts at first? Nihilego, UB-01 symbiont, is described less like a creature and more like a hazardous chemical spill. Its entries talk about it attaching to people's heads and amplifying their aggression, which the story quietly mirrors with Lucamine's obsession. It's not just spooky flavor text. It's the game telling you, in a roundabout way, that crossing dimensions has side effects. Then you get Buzzwole, this flexing mosquito that looks like a rejected superhero villain, but the Pokédex still treats it like an invasive species. It notes how it shows off its muscles to intimidate enemies, like a territorial animal that wandered in from a different ecosystem. Pheromosa is cataloged almost like a biohazard, with people reacting in fear to its presence. We're not just catching them, we're running a containment program. The Alola story leans into that. Wormholes open. These beings fall through, and suddenly the region has to improvise an extra-dimensional wildlife policy. Ether's research on Ultra Beasts plays out like a mix of curiosity, corporate secrecy, and one long legal gray area about what happens when you grab something from another universe and try to weaponize it. As a lawyer, I do have to point out, there is no clean jurisdiction for crimes committed while possessed by space jellyfish. But the game's kind of gesture at that moral mess anyway. And Ultra Beasts aren't the first time Pokemon flirted with aliens. Deoxys is literally a virus from space that mutated into a legendary, with forms that feel like biology and geometry arguing. Beheum and Elgium lean into classic UFO stories. Their names echo LGM and BEM, old sci-fi shorthand for little green men and bug-eyed monsters. Their Pokédex entries talk about memory manipulation and mysterious lights in the sky. You can basically hear the X-Files theme in the background. We even get abduction vibes. Bahiem supposedly alters people's memories and leaves them confused, like a sanitized version of alien encounter folklore. In this video, we're going to keep bumping into moments where the Pokédex quietly imports real-world myths like that and just leaves them there for you to notice. But here's the pattern interrupt. You don't actually need wormholes or UFOs to make Pokémon feel alien. Some of the strangest, most otherworldly designs in the series come from totally normal habitats, pushed to extremes. Creatures that live in pitch-black ocean trenches or cling to sheer, frozen cliffs might as well be Ultra Beasts to us. Next, so we're going to leave the cosmos behind and sink into those extreme environments, where the world gets hostile, the designs get weird, and the Pokémon are still technically local. So if Ultra Space felt strange, the funny thing is, we don't have to leave our own planet for things to get just as alien. Did you know that some of the calmest Pokédex entries are also describing places that would crush a human in seconds? Close your eyes for a second and picture Wailord, not as the goofy inflatable mascot from the anime, but as the float whale drifting over a lightless trench. The Pokédex quietly mentions its immense size and buoyancy, but the implication is pressure so intense that metal would bend. You and I are up here worrying about fan games and legal takedown notices. Down there, a Wailord exhale is basically a weather event. Relicanth pushes that even further. It's literally a living fossil, a Coelacanth reference that the games treat like a museum exhibit that just never closed. Its entries talk about how its body hasn't changed in 100 million years, how it just keeps swimming along the seafloor while continents and empires rise and fall overhead. In this video, we're going to keep hitting that mix of fantasy and real science, because Relicanth is basically an ecology lecture in a dive suit. Then there's Dragalge, hiding in drifting forests of seaweed. Its lore flat out says it mimics rotting kelp, poisoning ships that pass too close. That's camouflage, an invasive species energy rolled into one. A Pokemon that weaponizes looking like trash. It's weirdly grounded. Marine biologists really do worry about algae taking over harbors and choking out everything else, just usually without dragon poison. Now shift the camera. We leave the trenches and climb. The air thins, the color drains out, and we're walking into Abomasnow country. Its Pokédex entries talk about blizzards that appear out of nowhere when it gets angry, like it's a localized weather system with a bad mood. You can imagine a quiet, snow-covered forest, branches heavy with ice, and somewhere deep inside, that single tree giant breathing like a windstorm. Avalugg is literally a moving iceberg, carrying entire ecosystems on its back. One entry mentions Pokemon living in the cracks of its body, which is basically a symbiosis lecture disguised as a boss fight. It's a walking habitat. If Wailord is a blimp over the abyss, Avalugg is a continent that got bored and started commuting. Froslass brings in the ghost stories. Based on the Yukiana, it lures travelers through blizzards, and some entries hint that it's born from women lost in the snow. That's the game quietly importing real-world folklore about spirits and whiteout conditions, then toning it down just enough that kids read it as spooky instead of call a therapist. All of these habitats, the black water around Dragalge, the creaking ice under Avalugg, the frozen pines where Froslass waits, are extreme. But the way the Pokédex talks about them is oddly gentle. It leans on symbiosis, camouflage, invasive species, stuff like that, so you're half in a biology documentary and half in a ghost story. And once we've floated with Wailord and climbed past Obamas now, since we can't stay at the edges forever. Next, we're going to come back down to sea level, into cities, houses, and those boring early route Pokémon that, if you read closely, have some of the strangest lore in the entire series. So once we climb back down from the mountains and the haunted shipwrecks, we land somewhere a lot more familiar. Route 1. The place you sprint through, mash A, and forget. But did you know that some of the densest world building in Pokémon is hiding in those so-called trash encounters like Rattata, Pidgey, and Zigzagoon? The games quietly frame them as the background radiation of daily life. Rattata isn't just a purple share delivery system. Its entries talk about gnawing through anything, hoarding food, and infesting houses. That's basically the series admitting, yes, there's a pest control problem in Kanto. Pidgey is described as so docile and so common that people barely react when they see one. It kicks up sand to escape danger, scouts from above, and helps define what normal looks like in a region, the way pigeons and sparrows do for us. Then you get Zigzagoon, the living lost and found box. Its Hoenn Dex calls out that it's always wandering in zigzags because it's searching for dropped items. That's a throwaway line, but it explains why you, the player, can walk 10 feet into the grass and find a random potion. You're not special. You're just beating the local Zigzagoon to the loot. Later games quietly double back to these species and ask, okay, what if we took this idea to its logical extreme? Galarian Zigzagoon and Linoon become full black and white punks, then evolve into Obstagoon, who is literally a rock star that weaponizes blocking and yelling. The lore leans into them being rowdy, confrontational street performers, which makes sense if you start from, this Pokémon already scavenges and picks fights over scraps. It's the same animal, but reframed through a different culture. The way real-world cities remix the same species into mascots, pests, or icons. In the anime, these Pokémon are everywhere once you start looking. Rattata raiding markets at night, Pidgey delivering letters or just hanging out on power lines, Zigzagoon helping NPCs search for lost keys. They show up as background pets in houses, perched on fences, or assisting shopkeepers, and the show almost never points at them directly. They're just there, which is exactly how world building is supposed to feel. If we're going to talk about realism in a game about pocket gods, this is it. When you actually slow down and read those early route entries, each path starts to feel like its own tiny ecosystem. You've got the nervous prey species, the scavengers, the territorial birds, all interacting with human routines, trash, and architecture. As a lawyer, I'm contractually obligated to say this is not legally binding biology, but the illusion works. And once you notice that, you start noticing something else. Some of the most interesting lore isn't in the Pokémon at all. It's in the people. Who's feeding these flocks? Who's cleaning up after the Rattata? Who's hiring Obstagoon as security? In this video, we're going to follow that thread into the cities and towns themselves, where the Pokédex stops talking and the building layouts, item placements, and NPC routines quietly tell you how humans and Pokémon actually live together. And one region in particular hides a detail there that changes how you read the whole map. And once you start looking at the cities that way, the gyms suddenly stop being just boss fights and start looking a lot more like economic reports with better music. Did you know that almost every gym leader's team is basically a census of what that town does for a living? Orberg's rock types sit right on top of the coal seams and quarries that literally power Sinnoh. Driftvale's ground types match the bridge, the market, the shipping magnate who owns half the town. Pastoria's swampy roster fits a place built on wetlands management and fishing. It's not just vibes. It's the game quietly telling you what the local tax base looks like. Once you notice that, you start seeing it everywhere. Mistralton City has a flying gym and an airport. Hulbury has a water gym and a giant seafood market. In Galar, Turfield's grass types sit in the middle of farmland, while Motostoke's fire gym is bolted onto an industrial skyline that may as well have late-stage coal economy written across it in Unone. The gym leaders aren't just strong trainers. They're basically celebrity representatives of local industries, the way you'd have a mining town mayor or a shipping tycoon. The Pokédex and NPCs quietly back this up. They tell you Machoke and Machamp help construction crews, lifting steel beams and moving cargo. In multiple games, there are literal Machamp roadblocks acting as living traffic cones. You see Girder and Conkeldurr holding I-beams like lunchboxes. Flying types deliver mail. Unova straight up has a Pelipper-based postal route. In Kalos and Hoenn, workers mention using Pokemon to tunnel, dredge, and clear debris after storms. Like having an emergency management agency made of gravelers and whalmers. And then there's medicine. Chansey and Blissey in the anime. Chansey and Audino in the games, quietly staffing Pokemon centers, like an entire nursing union that never clocks out. There are Pokédex lines about Lucario sensing auras to locate people in disasters, and about fire types keeping people warm in blizzards. It's construction, transportation, healthcare, and emergency services, all running on this living, breathing infrastructure that never files for overtime. The funny thing is, the games almost never stop and explain this. There's no big lore dump. It's just there, in the background, like the soft hum of a refrigerator. You only notice when it turns off. We walk through cities, mash A to get past the worker dialogue, and miss the fact that the entire built environment assumes a world where your crane might be a Machamp and your ambulance has a Blissey inside. Pattern interrupt for you. Imagine trying to run a modern city in that world without Pokemon. No Machoke on work crews, no flying types for remote villages, no Chansey in the ER. The whole map collapses, and that's where this gets interesting, because it's not just that humans shape habitats and cities around Pokemon. Humans also start reshaping the Pokemon themselves, through breeding, training, and eventually, literally, building artificial life. In this video, we're going to follow that shift from using what nature gives you to editing nature directly. And one man-made Pokemon line in particular quietly exposes how far that goes. And the line that exposes it best isn't a hulking clone or a chimera in a lab coat. It's a pink polygon that technically doesn't even exist in the physical world. Did you know Porygon is one of the only Pokemon the games flat out say was made entirely by humans, out of computer code? Its original Pokédex entries describe it as a virtual Pokemon that can freely move in cyberspace, like somebody took missing number, filed the legal paperwork, and shipped it as a product. Later entries quietly update it as technology changes. Porygon 2 was upgraded for deep space exploration, and Porygon Z reads like a patch gone wrong, pure with unstable behavior, after an unauthorized modification. That's one of those places where flavor text is doing a lot of work. The games never stop and give you a lecture on AI safety or software updates, but they don't have to. You just see this manufactured Pokemon line literally glitching as the hardware jumps from Game Boy to DS to Switch, and it's hard not to read it as the series asking, in its own soft way, what happens when living things depend on firmware? Of course, when people think man-made Pokemon, they usually jump straight to Mewtwo. In the core games in the first movie, Mewtwo is the iconic genetically engineered Pokémon. Cloned from Mew, overpowered, and deeply unhappy about being treated as property. Even there, though, they pull their punches more than you might remember. The games tuck the backstory into lab journals on Cinnabar Island, and the movie spends most of its time on Mewtwo, figuring out identity and choice rather than on the experiments themselves. Over time, later movies and specials keep softening Mewtwo's edges. They give it quieter moments, a kind of wandering philosopher vibe, and even scenes where it actively protects humans. It's the same creature, same origin, but the camera angle shifts from weapon to person trying to recover from what they were built to be. Then you have the weirder edge cases. Type. Null and Silvally in Alola are literally attempts to recreate Arceus's power in a controllable package, complete with a restraint mask that reads more like something from a sci-fi courtroom drama than a kid's game. Genesect is an ancient fossil Pokémon that was revived and then weaponized with a cannon on its back. A kind of prehistoric bug repurposed for modern warfare. These aren't just cute oops, science went too far jokes. Their stories are full of words like project, control, and experiment. None of this ever turns Pokémon into a grim bioethics textbook. But sitting with these entries, especially late at night, you start to notice the pattern. The more humans try to engineer or upgrade Pokémon, the more the Pokédex quietly nudges you to ask where the line between natural and artificial actually is. If Porygon can feel confusion after a bad patch, or Mewtwo can question its own purpose, at what point does Tool become someone? And as much as the series leans on labs and computers for those questions, not every strange origin in this world comes from a test tube. Some of the most unsettling backstories are wrapped in myths, legends, and stories trainers tell each other around campfires about legendary and mythical Pokémon. And in a minute, we're going to walk into that part of the Pokédex, where the explanations stop sounding like science and start sounding like folklore. When the science runs out, the stories start. Did you know that in the Sinnoh games, the closest thing we get to a creation myth is just 3 Pokémon quietly holding the universe together in the background? Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina sound like boss fights, but in the lore, they're more like cosmic maintenance workers. Dialga doesn't just control time in a flashy anime way. The Sinnoh myths say time itself started moving when its heart began to beat. Palkia does the same for space, warping dimensions so there's actually room for a world. And Giratina gets banished to the distortion world, watching over antimatter and the places that don't quite fit. It's framed less like a legal exile and more like a necessary role. Someone has to look after the shadows so the light can stay stable. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that idea. Legendary Pokémon as explanations, old Sinnoh temple carvings, and Kanalav library books. Talk about them the way real-world cultures talk about sky gods and underworld guardians. You never see them picking fights with random trainers. You hear about them in stone tablets, bedtime stories, and that one NPC who definitely reads way too much. Hoenn does something similar, but with weather instead of physics. On paper, Gruden, Kyogre, and Rayquaza are framed as these huge forces that clashed, but the older myths read more like nature documentaries than action movies. Groudon isn't just land Pokémon. It's the reason there's ground to stand on. Kyogre is the sea given a name. Their so-called conflict feels like a story about droughts and floods, the way climates swing back and forth. Rayquaza only shows up when the balance tips too far, settling things back into a long, slow cycle. If you think of it that way, their battles become more like seasons turning than a constant war. Not every legendary is a walking natural disaster, though. Some are basically gratitude postcards that learned how to float. Shaman drifts through flower fields, purifying polluted land almost as an afterthought. Celebi shows up where forests are protected, hopping through time not to rewrite history, but to quietly check that everything's still growing. Manaphy bonds with anyone who raises it, then returns to the sea to lead others, like the ocean's tiniest, friendliest lawyer, drafting peace treaties between currents. Most people in the games never see any of them. They just pass down stories, carve ruins, and write Pokédex entries that sound half like research notes and half like lullabies. That distance makes the legendaries feel almost dreamlike, as if you're dozing off in a world where the big forces are already handled. And once the big myths feel safe, your brain has room for the tiny mysteries. Because right after the gods of time and space clock out, we're going to zoom all the way down into the legal fine print of the Pokémon world. The strange behavior of specific moves, items that work like loopholes, and competitive quirks so weird they might as well be glitches in reality. Why does one move rewrite turn order? Why does another ignore sleep entirely? And which of them quietly got nerfed when nobody was paying attention? So did you know that some of the scariest Pokémon to fight in competitive play are the ones that look like they're just there to hold your items and cheer from the sidelines? The classic example is Chansey. Big egg, tiny arms, no visible muscles. But the moment you give it an Eviolite, its defenses basically put on a business suit and pass the bar exam. It doesn't knock you out. It just refuses to faint, calmly healing, spreading status, and turning every battle into a slow, soft war of attrition. Ferrothorn is the same kind of lie. It waddles in looking like a lawn ornament, and then suddenly your whole team is getting chipped by iron barbs and entry hazards. In this video, we're going to keep the numbers light, but the story is simple. Some Pokémon win not by hitting harder, but by outlasting everything, punishing you every time you even think about attacking them. They're less gladiators and more legal departments. They don't throw punches. They bury you in consequences. Then you get the really odd interactions. The places where the game feels like it's arguing with itself. Priority moves like Extreme Speed or Aqua Jet quietly rewrite the turn order, so a tiny, exhausted Pokémon can move before a legendary giant. Weather does it too. Under rain, Swift Swim users suddenly act like they've had 3 cups of coffee. Under sun, chlorophyll Pokémon sprint like they're late for a meeting with Nintendo's lawyers. Entire strategies live in that rhythm, where you're not just attacking, you're scheduling who gets to move when. Abilities can feel like legal loopholes. An ability like Levitate just says, actually, the floor doesn't apply to me. And a whole class of ground-type attacks simply fail. Magic Bounce reflects status moves back at the user, like a cease and desist that boomerangs. You try to paralyze it, and you're the one who ends up slowed. Did you ever notice how that feels less like a fight and more like paperwork? Being returned, stamped, denied. What's fun is how the Pokédex sometimes whispers this stuff in advance. A sneaky Pokémon gets flavor text about lurking in shadows or stealing items, and then in battle it shows up with moves like knockoff, trick, or substitute, turning the field into a little con game. Fast, agile species are described as darting between trees or running silently at night. And sure enough, they become natural users of priority or pivot moves, slipping in and out while bulkier teammates take the hits. Even some ghost types that used to have darker entries about death and the afterlife end up as weirdly perfect status spreaders and stallers, haunting you turn after turn instead of knocking you out outright. And behind all of that, there's the quiet sense that the games themselves are being optimized. over generations, moves get tiny power tweaks, abilities get reworded, whole strategies get gently nudged out of the spotlight, while new ones are ushered in. Somewhere under the surface, there are traces of scrapped mechanics, half-finished ideas, and old interactions that no longer work, like prior drafts of a contract. In a minute, we're going to dig into those leftovers, the cut moves, the unused items, and the data ghosts that hint at a very different version of how Pokémon battles could have played out. If you crack open a Pokémon cartridge the way a lawyer cracks open a contract, you find something weird, whole paragraphs that were never meant to be read. Did you know that almost every mainline game ships with moves, items, and even half-finished forms just sitting there, quietly commented out by reality? Data miners have basically become the archivists of this hidden layer. They comb through the code and keep stumbling on things like placeholder moves with no effects, just names and numbers. In some generations, there are test moves that only ever hit Metapod in internal battles, or duplicate versions of standard attacks clearly used to tune damage. You'll see stuff like hit or debug move sitting next to actual signature attacks, like someone left their scratch paper inside the final exam. Items are even stranger. There are balls you can't obtain, key items with no events tied to them, and leftover entries from features that were cut late. In the Gen 2 code, there are traces of a GS Ball event, far more elaborate than the one we eventually saw, suggesting they wanted that tie-in with the anime to be a much bigger deal. Later games hide things like unused mail, mystery tickets, and odd held items that never get a legal distribution. They exist. The game recognizes them. You just never legitimately touch them. Sometimes we don't just get objects, we get fossils of entire mechanics. Early builds of the fairy type, scrapped HMs, or beta forms that look like alternate evolutions all show up in the data. Shellos and Gastrodon famously have unused forms in Diamond and Pearl, hinting that they were planned much earlier and maybe for a different region layout. There are partial models for alternate Kyurem fusions and weird parameter sets that imply someone at Game Freak once tested totally different stat spreads or move pools for certain Pokémon before pulling back. If you zoom out, these leftovers sketch out alternate timelines. What if that extra town referenced in the map data had shipped with its own gym and story arc? What if the GS Ball event had been a global in-game mystery instead of a Japan-only curiosity? Every unused ticket, every abandoned move slot, is a tiny branch where the series could have gone left instead of right. We're basically reading the red lines on Pokémon's design history, and fans absolutely treat them that way. Entire fan games and ROM hacks are built around restoring cut maps, making those unobtainable items actually trigger events or turning beta sprites into full Pokédex lines. People write essays and theory videos about why a scrapped ghost-type move would have broken competitive, or how an unused form might connect to some obscure Pokédex entry. It's like paleontology, but for code. We're reconstructing a living thing from scattered bones. In this video, we're going to keep peeling back layers like that. We've looked at the silent leftovers in the data. Next, we'll listen for the ones hiding in plain sight. After the break, we'll move into another kind of invisible architecture. How music, sound design, and those oddly specific Pokémon cries quietly shape the mood of each region, and why a single battle theme can tell you more about a character than 3 pages of dialogue ever could. So if the data is the skeleton of these games, the sound is the heartbeat. Did you know that on the original Game Boy, every single Pokémon cry had to fit into a tiny handful of beeps and noise channels, and yet somehow Pikachu still sounds cute while Onyx sounds like a gravel truck dying. Same hardware, same rules, totally different personalities. Those cries were basically little legal contracts with the sound chip. No fancy samples, just pitch, length, and a few waveforms. Game Freak's composers had to negotiate with that limitation, and so they leaned on shape instead of realism. Pikachu gets a quick rising chirp. Onyx gets this jagged descending roar. Even without color or animation, your brain fills in the rest. We're going to see this over and over tonight. Technology quietly steering emotion. As the series moved to the DS and beyond, they didn't just throw those cries out, though. They're like case law. You don't overturn them lightly. Instead, they were subtly remastered. Harsh, bit-crushed edges got smoothed, some pitches were adjusted, so they wouldn't pierce your ears through headphones at 2 a.m., and a few legendary cries picked up extra nuance, like faint echoes or layered tones. It's still the same word in Pokémon language, just spoken with a clearer microphone. You can really hear this with long-lived mascots. Compare early Pikachu to its later games. It's higher, softer, less like a glitching modem. Meanwhile, something like Gyarados keeps that abrasive snarl, but the static hiss is toned down so it feels powerful instead of physically painful. Nintendo knows you're going to hear these hundreds of times. They're optimizing for comfort without breaking nostalgia. Outside of battles, the whole world is basically scored like a slow, looping lullaby. Pallet Town's theme is just a few gentle chords and a wandering melody, but for a lot of us, it's shorthand for safety. Ecruteak City mixes in that faint, traditional-sounding instrumentation, so even as the lore talks about burned towers and ghost types, the music says, "You're okay. Just walk a little slower." Lumiose City at night almost feels like a different game entirely, with those soft jazz chords and distant traffic noises suggesting a living city that keeps going while you put the 3DS to sleep. Then there's the ambient sound design that creeps in under the music. The constant rainfall on Route 119, the wind over Mount Coronet, the waves on any quiet Hoenn shore. Half the time you don't notice them until you mute the game and suddenly everything feels wrong. Some caves add a faint drip and echo, turning a simple corridor into a place you remember as that eerie one, even if nothing legally scary ever happens there. In this video, we talk to composers and sound designers who describe these details as emotional lighting. You don't stare at it, but you'd notice if it disappeared. So as you're listening now, imagine your favorite route or town theme fading in under my voice. Maybe it's Pallet Town. Maybe it's a weird pick, like some forgotten side route from a fan game you loved before a takedown notice made it vanish. Let it loop quietly in the back of your mind. Because next, we're going to follow that imaginary camera, away from the speakers, down the path, and into the parts of each region that were redesigned, censored, or outright erased, places the official soundtrack never got to play for very long. So as that imaginary camera slips off the beaten path, it doesn't just find cut maps and censored signs. It also finds something softer, the way every region in Pokémon has its own mood, just from color and light alone. Did you know that if you line them up in your head, Kanto almost feels like an old CRT screen? Flat blues, clean greens, bright white menus. It's simple, almost toy-like, all because the hardware forced it to be. Then Johto leans into golds and deep blues, like an evening walk. By the time we get to Hoenn, the saturation's cranked up. The ocean roots almost glow, which makes sense for a region obsessed with N versus C. Sinnoh cools everything down. The snow, the pale sky, the soft purples in Heart Home at night. They all make the region feel slower, older, a little heavier. Unova shifts again. Sharp contrasts, bright city neons, dark rural roots. King Kalos is pastel and romantic. Alola is sun-bleached and hazy. Galar is all moody clouds and dramatic lighting. And Paldea wraps the day in those long orange sunsets. Even if you never thought about it, your brain did. If you pause almost anywhere, the game quietly admits how much work went into this. Posters in houses that hint at contests or at long-gone events. Half-finished mugs of tea on tables in Galar that make it feel like you just missed a conversation. In Unova, NPCs in the background stretch, tap their feet, check their phones. Stuff like that doesn't shout at you, but it makes the world feel lived in, like you've walked into a snapshot instead of a set. Shiny Pokémon follow the same logic more often than you'd expect. Sometimes they're just high-contrast eye candy, but sometimes they're little visual jokes. Shiny Gyarados is a red carp-turned dragon, echoing the Chinese legend directly. Shiny Charizard flips from warm orange to black and teal, like a literal shadow of its normal self. Some shinies nod to real-world variants, like pink Butterfree referencing rare butterflies, or they echo old concept art that never made it into the final palette. And then there's time itself. Day-night cycles and weather aren't just encounter tables. They're mood swings. Route themes in Sinnoh feel totally different under a soft nighttime filter. A rainy route in Hoenn can turn a cheerful trumpet track into something almost nostalgic. In Galar, a foggy wild area feels like a different game than the same field under a clear sky. As a lawyer, I wish legal documents changed tone this dramatically with the weather. Unfortunately, they're gray at noon and they're gray at midnight. Here's the pattern interrupt. Once you notice how the light changes, you start noticing something else the games keep circling around. Cemeteries that glow a little cooler at night. Ghost-type entries that quietly soften over generations. In this video, we're going to follow that trail, because just as the visuals and music evolved, so did the way Pokémon talks about death, the afterlife, and the slow passage of time. And the next section goes straight into the parts they almost didn't put in at all. So let's follow that trail a little more closely. Because did you know some of the darkest lines in the early Pokédex quietly evaporate over time? Not with a big announcement, not with a legal takedown, just a slow sanding down of the edges until the same Pokémon feels like it's being described through frosted glass. Take the classic, Kadabra. In early Dex entries, it's this straight-up possession story. A boy with psychic powers wakes up one morning, and he's just Kadabra now. No metaphor, no it is said. Just a human life rewritten into a monster with a spoon. Later, generations keep the high IQ, the spoons, the bending reality, but the boy disappears. The wording drifts toward a Pokémon with strong psychic powers appears, instead of a kid turned into this and your bedtime is ruined. Ghost types got the same treatment. Gengar in the early games is literally described as a shadow that takes the place of someone who dies, or a figure that stalks you in the dark and laughs if you're scared. By the time we get to later generations, the focus leans more into pranks, mischief, and it likes to play around in the night. The death part doesn't go away so much as it gets tucked into implication, like a horror movie you're watching, with the brightness turned way down. Drifloon is another one. Originally, it's the balloon that straight up tries to drag children to the afterlife. That's the line. Later on, the entries start hedging. It tugs on children's hands. It seems to like kids. It wanders about, carried by the wind. If you only read the newer ones, you might think it's just a slightly clingy balloon. You'd never guess it used to be one of the most alarming lines of text in the game. We see this pattern over and over. Yamask begins as a human spirit, clutching its old face, crying when it remembers its life. Later, the emphasis is on the mask itself, on ruins and artifacts in this ancient cultures. The sadness is still there, but it's framed as mysterious behavior, instead of existential crisis in one sentence. You can almost feel the series learning how to say the same thing. Softer. Why the shift? Part of it is probably simple. Broader audiences, international attention, and ratings boards that get a little nervous when a kid's first ghost type reads like a campfire story your older cousin definitely shouldn't be telling you. As Pokémon became a global brand, Nintendo had to think not just about a single cartridge, but about cartoons, merchandise, parents, and how this all looks when you're not already used to weird Japanese ghost stories. But the core ideas never fully vanish. They leak out through move names like Curse, through designs like Kofagrigus and Runerigus, through side stories in the anime and manga, where the writers can be a bit more direct. The franchise doesn't really abandon the dark stuff. It just hides it in the margins, where curious players can still find it if they read between the lines. And while those explicit mentions of death and possession get toned down, something else is quietly dialed up in the background. More diverse characters, more regions inspired by different cultures, and more emotional storytelling. In the next section, we're going to look at how, even as the text got softer, the people and perspectives inside the world of Pokémon started to expand in ways the early games never quite had room for. So as the ghosts and curses in the Pokédex get a little quieter, the people on screen start talking a bit louder. Did you know that if you line the games up in order, you can almost watch the cast of Pokémon slowly learn how to emote, argue, and actually process feelings? In the early days, your protagonist is basically a very determined mannequin. Red never speaks, never reacts. He just stares down a level 70 Pikachu and wins. Rivals like Blue are single-note archetypes, smug, fast, gone. That silence was partly technical, but also stylistic. The game wants you to project yourself into that blank space, so it keeps the script simple, and the faces even simpler. By the time we hit Unova, that starts to crack. Charon, Bianca, and N aren't just three copies of Friend Who Battles You Sometimes. They're three different responses to the same world. Charon wants strength. Bianca is unsure if she even belongs on a journey. And N is literally raised to believe Pokémon are suffering and should be freed. The camera lingers on them. They pace. They gesture. You can feel the writers pushing against that old silent hero mold without breaking it completely. Then in Alola, the dam really bursts. Lily is technically not the protagonist, but emotionally, she kind of is. She runs away from an abusive situation, hides Nebby in a bag, and spends the whole game learning to stand up to her mother and to her own fear. For a series that once treated parents as convenient HM dispensers, that's a huge shift. The story quietly folds in themes of family, control, and loss, without ever announcing, this is a very serious topic now. Alongside that, the character designs stop pretending the world is one default body in different hats. Starting around Unova, and especially in Kalos, Alola, and Galar, we get a wider spread of skin tones, from Elisa's pale runway glow to Lenora's darker, grounded museum curator look, to Nessa and Rayan basically walking fashion editorials. NPCs show different body types, older characters, kids in streetwear, tourists in loud shirts. It's still stylized, But the palette finally looks more like the real players holding the cartridge. And the clothes matter. When you customize your trainer in X and Y or Sword and Shield, you're not just swapping stats. You're deciding how you show up in this world. Hoodies, hijab-inspired headwear, punk jackets, school uniforms. Stuff like that quietly tells you, there's room for you here, even if the game never says it out loud. Because the stories are more personal, the big ideas land harder. Ends conflict about truth versus ideals. AZ'd wandering Kalos for 3,000 years after a war. Lily choosing to leave Alola to grow on her own. Those are still wrapped around gym badges and legendary Pokémon, but they give the familiar loop emotional gravity. We're going to dig into how that same impulse starts reshaping the myths themselves. Legendaries, creation stories, and what the games want you to believe is true, and what they're oddly careful not to prove. So once the games start giving you those AZ flashbacks and Lily monologues, something sneaky happens in the background. The facts start sounding a lot less like a textbook and a lot more like a campfire. Did you know that half the ghost-type Pokédex reads like a friend of a friend story your cousin swears is true? Drifloon supposedly drags children away. Banette is a plushie out for revenge. And Yamask is literally a human soul holding its own face. Nobody in universe is running double-blind studies on that. It feels like local rumor that somehow got printed. You see it with dragon types too. Gyarados, destroying entire cities. Hydreigon, devouring everything in sight, stuff like that. So the numbers don't add up. If every Hydreigon was that hungry, Unova would be a parking lot. What we're really looking at is folklore frozen into a UI element. The Pokédex is treated like hard data, but the tone is closer to your uncle telling you not to go near the old well after dark. The games even admit, very quietly, that people disagree about the big stuff. In Sinnoh, one NPC treats Dialga and Palkia as literal gods of time and space. Another calls them myths exaggerated over generations. In Galar, some characters insist Eternatus is the original Darkest Day, while others frame it as a symbolic story about human greed. Same events, same legendary Pokémon, different cultural spin. It's the series saying, here's the story they tell in this town. Make of it what you will. Once you notice that, all the bookshelves and museums start to feel different. Kanalov Library is full of short myths that contradict each other on creation order. The Celestic Town ruins show a mural that later games quietly reinterpret. In Hisui, the Galaxy team is literally building a regional Pokédex from scratch, and they're nervous about getting it wrong. History in Pokémon isn't a single canon scroll. It's a bunch of curators, each with their own gaps and biases, deciding what gets a plaque. That layered storytelling is why fan theories latch on so hard. When one Yamask entry mentions human souls and another quietly drops that angle, you can feel the edit, and your brain rushes to fill the space. We're going to see players spin that into entire timelines. Maybe the afterlife works differently now. Maybe the Pokédex got censored. Maybe a certain region just doesn't believe the old ghost stories anymore. In this video, we talk to people who turn those tiny contradictions into full fan fiction universes, alternate histories, and headcanons that are almost their own continuity. And fan creativity doesn't stop at text. Once you start treating the official lore like one culture's version of events, it's a very short hop to drawing your own myths, then coding them. That's where the art, the ROM hacks, the full-blown fan games come in. Whole regions and species built around, what if this legend was true instead? In the next section, we're going to follow that impulse all the way into the legal gray zone, where Nintendo's real-world story about ownership crashes into everyone else's stories about Pokémon. And once you've asked, what if this legend was true? The next step is almost inevitable. Okay, so where on the map does it live? Did you know there's an entire subculture of fans who don't just invent a single Pokémon? They lay out whole regions like they're urban planners with a Pokénav? Coastlines, mountain ranges, starter towns, victory roads, all sketched out in notebooks or pixel art, often based on places the official games haven't touched yet. You see patterns after a while. If Game Freak did New York for Unova and France for Kalos, fans look at, say, Brazil, India, or South Africa, and go, all right, our region's here. They'll mirror real transit lines with in-game routes, drop a ghost gym in the oldest city, tuck a fairy gym into a theme park analog, stuff like that. Some of these maps are so detailed, they include fake subway diagrams, climate charts, even where the Elite Four's waterfall actually drains. And once you have a map, you need a regional Pokédex. That's where Fakemon come in. These are fan-made Pokémon designs that try to answer a simple question. What kind of creature would evolve in this specific place? A Brazil-inspired region might get a capybara water type, a jaguar dark type, and a legendary based on the Boto River dolphin myth. An India-inspired region might lean on nagas, rakshasas, or living banyan trees, drawing on myths and animals the official games just haven't gotten around to yet. A lot of Fakemon quietly fill gaps you can feel in the real games. There are whole projects dedicated to giving evolutions to lonely single-stage Pokémon, like Dunsparce and Tauros, years before Game Freak finally did it. Others focus on new regional forms, Ice-type Arbok with a snow sculpture pattern, or a Steel-type Butterfree that's turned into a metallic drone. People even design regional professors and champions to add more cultural representation, more women in lead roles, more characters of color, more queer stories woven into the background. From a legal perspective, none of this is official. And in this video, we've already talked about how that can matter when a fan game gets too much attention. But if you zoom out and look at the patterns, these regions and Fakemon are almost like unpaid R&D. They show how deeply fans have internalized the lore, the type chart, the weird mechanical quirks like Curse behaving differently on ghosts, and even the aesthetics of things like Pikachu, gradually slimming down over the years. We're not saying Nintendo is secretly browsing forums for ideas, but we're also not saying that. As a lawyer with a calming voice, I am legally required to add, correlation is not causation. Still, it's fascinating how often a fan concept, like a haunted mask turning into a sarcophagus, or a regional ponyta tied to forest spirits, shows up later in some official form. In a minute, we're going to leave the hypothetical regions behind and curl back up with the canon ones. As you settle in, we'll take a cozy tour through a few specific evolutionary lines and trace how their designs shift between games, anime, and manga. How one idea can splinter into 3 or 4 different stories without ever quite breaking the illusion that it's all the same Pokémon world. So let's actually do that. Instead of sprinting across the whole Pokédex, we're going to slow down and walk along a single branch, Eevee, and every strange little life decision it can make. Did you know that Eevee's entire gimmick quietly tracks the history of the games themselves? In Red and Blue, it's this unstable normal type with irregularly configured DNA, a kind of walking design excuse that lets the artists bolt on almost anything later. Its 3 original evolutions are basically an elemental thesis statement. Vaporeon, melting into water, Jolteon, bristling like static, Flareon, as a living furnace. Same base creature, 3 environments, 3 moods. As the series grows, the Pokédex keeps tucking in tiny behavioral notes. Vaporeon lives close to water, sometimes literally dissolving into it. Jolteon is skittish and temperamental, Spike's reacting to emotion like a mood ring that can tase you. Flareon hoards heat, described as storing fire in its fluffy body. None of this is a plot point. It's just background radiation that makes the same family feel like it's scattering into different biomes. The anime leans into that. We get the Eevee brothers showing off their stone evolutions like car models, then later episodes with a shy Eevee that refuses to evolve, or Lana's hyper-confident Vaporeon, or Serena's Sylveon built on affection. Spin-offs quietly echo it in Pokémon Colosseum and XD. Espeon and Umbreon are your partners from the opening, literal embodiments of day and night loyalty. In Pokémon Go, you can rename Eevee to nudge its form, turning an in-universe, unpredictable DNA joke into a real-world naming trick. When Espeon and Umbreon arrive in Gold and Silver, they retroactively change what Eevee is about. Suddenly, it's not just about stones, it's about friendship and time. The games start caring about how long you walk with it, when you level it, whether you treat it well. Later, Leafeon and Glaceon tie it to location-based evolution, specific mossy or icy rocks, while Sylveon in X and Y is locked behind high friendship and fairy-type moves, literally weaponized affection. One cute fox quietly tracks the series' experiments with time systems, friendship mechanics, map design, even the introduction of a new type. All of these layers invite you to pick a favorite and project onto it. Maybe you're a night person, so Umbreon feels right. Maybe you like the idea of a partner that only evolves when you really bond, so you go for Espeon or Sylveon. The games never say, "This is the correct Eevee." They just hand you a personality quiz disguised as evolution methods and let you answer it. And once you see that, you start noticing other lines that changed even more dramatically. Some didn't just evolve mechanically. They were rewritten by culture, controversy, and real-world legal attention. In this video, after the break, we'll zoom in on one of those families. A line whose design, name, and even existence inside certain games were quietly negotiated behind the scenes. The story there doesn't just involve artists and programmers. It involves TV networks, parents groups, and a very nervous Nintendo legal department. And sometimes, that nervous legal department doesn't just send a letter. It quietly reaches into the game and changes what you see on screen. Did you know that one of the most visible examples of this is Jinx? If you go back to early art and sprites, Jinx's face and hands are pitch black with big cartoon lips. Later, after criticism from writers and activists who argued the design echoed racist caricatures, Game Freak and Nintendo changed it. Starting in Generation 3 and in the anime, Jinx's skin became purple. Same dress, same hair, same typing. Different message. They never held a press conference about it, but the shift lines up with a broader conversation about representation in media at the time. And the company clearly decided they didn't want this Pokémon to be a case study in a law school discrimination seminar. In this video, we're going to keep seeing that pattern. The design stays, the details move. Jinx still appears in modern games, but some older episodes of the anime were edited or skipped in reruns, and certain pieces of promo art were quietly retired. If you only played later generations, you might never realize anything changed at all. But once you notice the before and after, it's almost impossible to unsee how one color swap reframed an entire character. Kadabra is the opposite kind of ghost. Its design barely changed, but its presence did. For years, there were Abra cards, Alakazam cards, Mega Alakazam cards, and a weird psychic gap where Kadabra should be. That wasn't a lore choice. That was a real-world legal dispute with illusionist Uri Geller, who claimed the spoon-bending Pokémon copied his likeness and shtick. He sued, complained in interviews, and for a long time, the safer move was just, don't print Kadabra. No big takedown, no dramatic ban, just absence. Open a binder from that era and you feel it like a missing tooth. Stuff like that shows how flexible Pokémon really is. Names get nudged to avoid trademarks or unfortunate meanings in another language. Poses in official art are rotated so a hand sign doesn't resemble a gang symbol somewhere. Pokédex lines about death or the afterlife, especially for ghost types, get softened in later games, turning what used to sound like a horror manga into something closer to a campfire story. Have you ever gone back to an old entry and thought, wait, they used to say that? None of this breaks the world. It just tilts it. The series isn't static. It responds to parents' groups, cultural shifts, and yes, the occasional lawyer with a very calm voice and a very long email. And if individual Pokémon can be reimagined like that, entire regions are fair game too. Because the next layer isn't just recolored faces or missing cards. It's when Kanto itself gets rebuilt, when Hoenn's water routes are redesigned, when an old story is remade with new mechanics and new cities. After the break, we'll look at how remakes and reimaginings quietly rewrite the rules of the journey you thought you already knew. And once entire regions are fair game, our memories start to get rewritten in real time. Did you know that a lot of people who swear they remember Kanto are actually remembering Fire Red and Leaf Green more than Red and Blue? The original Kanto had weirdly empty houses, blunt NPCs, and a Pokédex that was still figuring out what Pokémon even were. By the time we revisit it on the Game Boy Advance, suddenly the dialogue is softer. There are move tutors tucked into corners, and flavor text quietly cleans up older, harsher ideas. A line that once hinted at Kadabra being a transformed child becomes more vague, more urban legend than legal liability. Johto goes through the same time warp. In Gold and Silver, Ecruteak City feels almost sparse. A burned tower, a dance theater, and a lot of implied history. Heart Gold and Soul Silver walk back in and say, no, this is a pilgrimage site now. Extra NPCs talk about Ho-Oh and Lugia with near religious reverence. The kimono girls are woven into the main story. And Pokédex entries are updated to match newer lore about things like the afterlife and ghost types. Sometimes they even tone it down. Those creepier entries about spirits dragging people away get rephrased so they feel more like campfire stories than police reports. Then you get the mechanical retcons. When fairy type arrives, it doesn't just appear in Kalos. It seeps backward into Kanto and Johto. Clefairy, in once just a normal type mascot candidate, is suddenly a fairy, framed as something mystical instead of just pink and round. Moves are retyped. Old routes become stealth fairy habitats, and your mental image of early game normal spam quietly changes. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Mega Evolution drops into Hoenn like a meteor. Steven's obsession with stones is no longer just a quirk, it's a plot device. Did you know that for a whole generation of kids, the real Hoenn champion fight is the one where Metagross goes mega and the camera swings in dramatically? Even when they don't add new systems, they add new senses. The color palette in Heart Gold and Soul Silver makes Johto feel warmer, more autumnal, compared to the cooler, almost metallic look of the original Game Boy Color games. Camera pans and remakes linger on Sprout Tower, or the Magnet Train, telling you, hey, this matters now. Music gets richer. Violet City's theme picks up extra instruments. Vermilion's harbor feels more nostalgic than lonely. We're going to remember those remade tracks when we hum the old songs in our heads, even if our brain insists it's still 1999. So when you say, "I miss walking through Goldenrod at night," which version are you actually missing? The one with the simple tiles and crunchy chiptune, or the one with flower beds, updated billboards, and a remastered soundtrack? For most of us, it's a composite. Our inner map of Johto or Kanto is a legal mashup of sprites, models, fan art, anime shots, and whatever we last saw on Twitch. We talked to players who only realized years later that certain details they remembered from childhood were actually added in the remakes. And that layered memory isn't a bug. It's the point. The regions grow up as we do. The games keep revising their own stories, and we quietly revise ours alongside them. As you drift off, hold that thought, though, because next, we're going to look at how spin-offs and side media do the same thing, rewriting the world from completely different angles until even Nintendo can't keep all the versions straight anymore. And that rewriting doesn't just happen in official timelines. It happens in your head. Did you know that for a lot of players, the most powerful Pokémon lore isn't in a Pokédex entry at all? It's in the moment they picked their very first starter. You probably remember it more clearly than some real-life decisions. The flicker of the screen, the 3 sprites on the table, that tiny pause before you locked in Charmander, or Chikorita, or whoever felt right for reasons you couldn't quite explain. From that second on, every route, every rival fight, every close call in a gym quietly rewrote who that Pokémon was to you, no matter what the games or the anime said. We're going to see this over and over. Someone reads a Pokédex entry that says their beloved Gengar hides in the shadow of a prey, and they just ignore the creepy part. In their personal canon, Gengar is the goofball that survived on 1 HP against Cynthia. Yamask is supposed to carry a mask that was once its human face. But if your Yamask carried you through Unova, you probably don't picture existential horror. You picture that in brutal battle with Elesa, where it somehow stalled out, both Emolga with Curse. Yeah, those little stories color everything. When you go back to an old save file, it can feel weirdly like visiting your childhood hometown. The music in Eterna Forest hits. You see your oddly named Staraptor, maybe Burbloyer, if you were as cool as we were. And suddenly you remember exact patches of grass where you grinded levels, or the corner of the underground where you and a friend used to meet up. The region map becomes less of a game layout and more of a scrapbook. And replaying does the same thing. Returning to Hoenn on a modern console can feel like walking the same streets with new glasses on. You notice that weird house you never entered, or that one NPC line about ghost types that hints at darker lore. But it all gets filtered through the fact that this was the first game you ever beat without using a guide. The official story is one layer. Your story quietly sits on top. In this video, we talk to people who treat their nicknames as hard canon. Their shiny Luvdisk that showed up at 3 a.m. is more important than the fact that Luvdisk and Alamomola aren't actually related. The time their Pikachu survived a critical hit, it absolutely should not have survived matters more than any competitive tier list or damage calc. For them, the key facts are things like, "This Crobat never fainted," or "This Bulbasaur was my first trade on the playground." And when you read flavor text after that, it bends. A line about Curse being different for ghost types stops being abstract design trivia and starts being a specific memory of the time your Miss Magius used it in a desperate Elite Four run. The legal, cleaned-up versions of the lore that Nintendo publishes become suggestions, not rules. So as we drift back out from those private timelines into the wider Pokémon world, keep that feeling in mind, because next, where we're going to zoom out to the places where all those personal stories crash into spin-offs, manga, and side games. And the result is a world so crowded with overlapping truths that even the Pokédex can't keep its story straight anymore. And once you notice that the Pokédex can't keep its story straight, you start seeing the seams that tie everything together. Did you know the games quietly act like there's one big, messy shared timeline? Even when they pretend each region is its own little bubble? You get it in the Pokédex first. A random entry for Corsola in Galar suddenly talks about environmental damage, which makes more sense if you remember earlier Jen's describing thriving coral reefs in Johto and Hoenn. Yamask remembers its human life in Unova. Cofagrigus in the same games is rumored to swallow grave robbers. And then Runerigus in Galar drags in a totally different ancient curse from another land. On paper, they're just spooky ghost types. In practice, it feels like we're watching different cultures interpret the same supernatural history. Ruins and myths do the same thing. The Sinjo Ruins event in Heart Gold and Soul Silver literally welds Sinnoh's creation trio lore onto Johto's tower legends. Hoenn's Regipuzzles reference distant lands that suddenly make more sense once Sinnoh and Unova arrive with their own ancient golems and sealed chambers. The games never put a big red arrow on any of this. They just drop a tablet, a line of NPC dialogue, and walk away. Meanwhile, modern life quietly proves everyone shares a world. Every region has Pokeballs, PCs, and healing machines, but the branding shifts. Kanto and Johto lean on Sylph Company and Bill's storage system. Hoenn brings in Devon Corp. Later gens mention Fennel's Dream Mist research and even upgrade the PC UI in-universe. It's the same basic tech, but you can see corporations competing, scientists iterating, and older regions slowly catching up. Organizations echo across borders, too. Team Rocket dissolves in Johto, but their experiments on things like Mewtwo and radio waves cast a long shadow over later evil teams, weaponizing energy, ultra beasts, or legendary Pokemon. Even the simple fact that every league uses the same badges plus Elite Four structure suggests some international rules committee we never quite meet. As a lawyer, I have questions about their labor policies, but in this video we're going to let that one slide. Then there's travel. NPCs casually mention going on vacation to Alola, moving from Kalos to Galar for work, or importing Pokemon through trade routes. The fact that you can catch the same species in wildly different regions, or only through in-game trades with foreign trainers, quietly implies migration patterns, tourism, and maybe some very confused customs officers. And most of these connections are so subtle, you only notice them if you read slowly, or if you've played way too many games back-to-back like we have. They're not big legal plot twists that demand attention. They're soft background details, the kind you remember at 2 a.m. and think, wait, does that mean Kanto and Paldea are on the same planet in real time? So here's our little pattern interrupt. We've been sprinting through lore, but next we're going to slow down. We'll ease into a calmer recap of some of the most soothing, strange, and quietly connected Pokemon facts we've covered so far, and let those threads pull you the rest of the way towards sleep. So let's actually do that. Let's slow the whole game down for a minute and just drift back through the Pokédex together, almost like you're flipping pages in your head while your eyes stay closed. Earlier in this video, we spent a lot of time on ghost types and how their entries quietly changed over the years. Remember how early Yamask was literally described as carrying its own human face, and later games sanded that down? Or how Drifloon supposedly dragged kids away, but then got rephrased into something a little less lawsuit baiting? That softening isn't random. It mirrors the series sliding from urban legend campfire stories into bedtime story territory. The ghosts didn't go away. They just stopped looking straight at the camera. As you breathe in, you can think back to the design tour we've been on. We started with simple creatures, stuff like Pidgey just being a bird, or Seal being, well, a seal with a horn. Then we followed that thread into myths and folk tales, like Ninetales and its cursed fox legends, Galarian Ponyta glowing like a forest spirit, and Absol getting stuck as the disaster scapegoat. From there, the shapes got stranger. Swords that are secretly ghosts, keys that might be haunted, your Ultra Beasts that look like they escaped a completely different game. And then paradox forms came in, like someone flipped through paleo art and sci-fi concept sheets and said, "We're going to put both in the same region and not fully explain it." Did you know that a lot of the wrong Pokédex lines we mentioned fit better if you treat them as tall tales? The 10,000-degree mag cargo, the Wailord, that somehow weighs less than a real whale, or the Alakazam, that allegedly has an IQ score instead of a nature. Instead of errors, they read like in-universe playground rumors, the way kids on the Saffron Magnet schoolyard might brag that their Kadabra can bend time. As a lawyer, I'm contractually obligated to tell you that those numbers would never hold up in court. But as a Pokemon fan, I kind of like that the Pokédex lies to us sometimes. All through that, there were emotional threads we kept coming back to. The gentle giants, like Wailord and Gudra, huge bodies wrapped around very soft hearts. The artificial Pokemon, from Porygon being literally man-made code, to type, Null, and Silvally, built as weapons and then slowly treated like real partners. Legendary guardians watching over regions that don't always deserve them. And the tiny root companions, your early game bug, your first dog. The normal type that never makes it onto a championship team but still gets a nickname. As you let the details blur a little, you don't need to hold on to which region came first, or which entry was from which generation. You can just let the patterns sit in the background. Ghosts getting gentler, designs getting weirder, stories contradicting themselves in a way that feels more like folklore than a legal document. We talked to translators, artists, and data miners earlier, but right now, none of them need your attention. Right now, the only job you have is to listen as we gently tug on a few more of those threads and follow them into the quieter, stranger corners of the Pokemon world. And the funny thing is, the more we tug, the more we realize the threads never really stop. Every new generation doesn't just tape another 100 Pokemon onto the end of the list. It quietly rewrites what was already there. A ghost type that used to sound like a serial killer in the Pokédex suddenly gets a softer, almost apologetic entry in a later game. Like the localization team collectively decided, okay, maybe not right before bedtime. Did you know that if you read the Pokédex in order, across every region, it starts to feel less like a database and more like folklore layered over itself? First, Yamask is a tragic human soul carrying its own face. Then Kofagrigus shows up, turning grave robbers into mummies. Generations later, Runerigus appears in Galar, and now the same kind of spirit is trapped in a cursed stone dragged out of a construction site. It's the same ghost story told 3 different ways, because time has passed and the storyteller's changed. But it isn't just Nintendo and Game Freak doing the storytelling. Between those official releases, it's you and people like you who keep the world moving. Fan games, zines, comics, ROM hacks, those weirdly detailed Reddit theories about Luvdisk and Alamomola secretly sharing an ancestor. All of that is parallel canon. None of it is legally real, but it still shapes how we remember the games. When we talked to fan devs earlier in this video, a lot of them basically said the same thing. They weren't trying to replace Pokémon. They were trying to fill in the quiet spaces between announcements. Over time, those quiet spaces get crowded with little details. Pikachu slims down so the anime can make it bounce around more. Early Kanto sprites don't quite match the modern art, like they slipped in from a slightly different universe. Move descriptions hint at mechanics the code never fully commits to, like Curse behaving one way for ghost types and another way for everyone else. Every time they patch something, or retcon a myth, or tone down a creepy line, they open up 3 new questions. And if you're still awake, your brain is probably already chasing one of them. In that sense, the Pokémon world isn't something you just consume. It's something you participate in. The stories you tell your friends about the first time you saw Missing No. The way you explain a regional form to someone who skipped a generation. The headcanon you quietly adopt about why certain Pokédex entries contradict each other. Those are all tiny edits to the shared script. Even if you never open a game engine or draw fan art, you're still co-writing the folklore every time you talk about it. So as we start drifting toward our closing thoughts, you don't need to remember every fact we've covered. Your brain will keep the ones it likes and discard the rest. And tomorrow, when you see a random Pokémon and some half-forgotten line of flavor text bubbles up, that's the world expanding again, just a little. Because we're not quite done yet. There's one last corner of this endless Pokédex we haven't opened. And it's the part they almost never mention out loud. By now, a lot of you are already gone. As in, fully asleep, phone face down on the pillow, the algorithm quietly tucking you in with autoplay. That's exactly what in this video was built for. Long, gentle stretches of Pokémon facts. Just interesting enough to follow, but soft enough that your brain eventually decides, we're going to process this later, and hits the off switch. If you're somehow still awake, you're in a pretty small party right now. It's just us, the last few trainers wandering the route after dark. So let's do something simple. If your eyes are open and you have a little attention left, tell us your favorite oddly specific Pokémon fact in the comments. The weirder and more niche, the better. Stuff like, did you know that Yamask's Pokédex entries quietly imply it remembers its life as a human? Or that Pikachu used to be chubby before they slimmed it down for animation? You can also use that space to nudge us. If there's a Pokémon line you want a full deep dive on in a future-long episode, write it down while you're here. Maybe you want us tracing every Jinx redesign and name change across regions. Maybe you want a legal autopsy of one specific fan game and every takedown it dodged. Maybe you just want us to follow one evolutionary line from real-world inspiration to anime cameos to weird competitive sets. We talked to developers, translators, and data miners for this series. We're happy to go back into the archives for one species if you ask. If you're too tired to type, that's fine. You don't have to do anything. Just know you can always add this to a sleep or study playlist. That way you can drop back into different sections on other nights without hunting for timestamps or trying to remember where the really soothing part about unused moves was. You press play, lie back, and let the games, the glitches, the quiet legal drama of Nintendo and their fan games drift past. From here, the pacing is going to slow down. Shorter thoughts, longer pauses, simple sentences. This is where my day job as a lawyer turns into something closer to a white noise machine with opinions about localization. You don't need to remember every region-locked event or every strange Pokédex line. You can let them pass like scenery outside a train window. And if you like this, there will be more. More long-form sessions. More deep corners of the Pokémon world. Design documents that never made it to daylight. Beta maps, scrapped towns, spin-off lore. All in the same calm, detailed style. You'll be able to put them in the same playlist and just wander through. So if you're still here, you can gently decide what happens next. Comment or don't. Queue up another episode, or let this one fade out. Either way, we're going to keep the volume low, the facts steady, and the world of Pokémon turning softly in the background while you finally log off for the night. And if you'd rather not log off just yet, you can kind of let the video keep playing in your head for a minute. Close your eyes and picture this with us. Somewhere just off screen, there's a Pokédex that never runs out of pages. Not the little handheld from the anime, but something bigger, like a hardback book that decided it wanted to be a library. The cover's already open, and the pages are just quietly turning themselves one at a time, whether you're watching or not. Every soft flip is another entry, another tiny sentence about some Pokémon doing something weird or kind or completely mundane. Did you know there are whole chains of Pokédex text that only make sense if you read them across generations? Like someone's been sneaking in a bedtime story line by line. We're not going to chase those tonight. We're just going to let the pages move on their own. On one of them, you land on Lapras. No corporate drama, no legal takedown, no fan games getting too much attention. Just a big, gentle Pokémon that, according to a bunch of those entries, spends its time ferrying people over calm seas, listening to voices, and singing so quietly, you almost miss it. You can imagine the ocean at night, the game UI gone, just the sound of water, and that slow, steady motion forward. If you flip a little farther, maybe it's Shaman instead, curled up in a field that looks like the flowery roots from the DS era. Grass moving, stars overhead, nothing trying to feint anything else for once. In this video, we spent hours pulling apart how designs got made, how localization teams argued over names, how Nintendo decided which projects to nudge and which ones to ignore. Out here, none of that really matters. It's just one small creature, in one small patch of the Pokémon world, finally resting. And you don't have to remember any of this. That's the point. All the obscure Pokédex trivia, the cut content, the glitches, the weird crossovers with the anime and the manga, those can just drift past like roots seen from the back of a flying taxi. Your brain is allowed to drop the thread. You showed up, you listened, you let your mind wander somewhere familiar and strangely safe. That's enough. So, thank you for spending this time with us. We talked to developers and translators and dug through old interviews to build the noisy parts of the story. You brought the quiet part by being here at the end. From here, we're going to say less and let the background do more. The last pages of that endless Pokédex can keep turning without narration, without explanation, without anything that needs your attention. You can stay for the ambience, or you can let the screen fade and put the controller down for the night. Either way, we'll be here next time you want to open the book again. Good night.